I wore a scratchy polyester security uniform to work every single night just to watch over the empire I built with my bare hands. My son-in-law, the man I trusted to sit in the CEO chair, looked right through me like I was a piece of garbage on his shoe. He thought I was just a broke old man, clinging to his daughter for survival. So one Tuesday morning, he called me into his lavish corner office and fired me without a second thought. He smiled when he did it. But what DeAndre Washington did not know was that with the flick of his expensive gold pen, he had just tried to fire the man who secretly owned 85% of his entire company. The air inside the executive suite on the 50th floor was always kept at a crisp 68 degrees, but inside my cheap uniform, I was sweating. My name is Harrison Miller. I am 68 years old. For the past 2 years, I have walked these halls not as the founder of Miller Global Freight, but as a night shift security guard. It was a choice I made out of love. When my daughter Chloe married DeAndre, I wanted to give them the world. I wanted to protect his fragile ego, so I stepped away and let him take the glory. I took a minimum wage job in my own building just to stay close to my life work and keep a quiet eye on things. DeAndre Washington was 34 years old. Today he was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than the first truck I ever drove. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk that I had personally picked out for this office. It was a $20,000 piece of furniture that now felt like a barricade between my family and the truth. He did not even look up from his computer monitor when I walked in. He let me stand there in the center of the room for 3 full minutes. The silence was heavy and suffocating. Finally, he sighed aggressively and picked up a crisp white envelope from his desk. He did not hand it to me. He tossed it. The envelope slid across the polished wood and fell off the edge, landing right at the tips of my heavy black work boots. I looked down at the floor and then back up at him. My chest tightened with a heavy, painful sorrow. "Pick it up, Harry," he said. His voice was dripping with that smooth corporate arrogance he had perfected over the years. "I am letting you go, effective immediately." I stared at him, trying to keep my breathing steady. My hands were rough and calloused from decades of gripping a steering wheel and hauling freight across the country. I slowly reached down and picked up the envelope. I did not open it. I asked him why. I asked him what I had done wrong. I had never missed a single shift. I had never been late to work. DeAndre leaned back in his expensive leather chair and steepled his fingers. He looked at me with absolute disgust. "Your boots," he said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my feet. "You tracked mud onto the executive carpet near the elevators last night. We have international investors coming in this afternoon. I cannot have this office looking like a cheap truck stop just because my father-in-law does not know how to wipe his feet. It is embarrassing, Harry. You are an embarrassment to me." The excuse was so flimsy it felt like a physical blow to the stomach. The carpets were spotless. I always made sure of it. I took pride in this building. This had absolutely nothing to do with mud on my shoes. This was about power. This was about him putting an old man in his place. "You are firing me over a smudge on the carpet?" I asked. My voice was low and thick with emotion. "DeAndre, my daughter Chloe thinks the world of you. I took this job just to stay active, just to be close to the family business. You know I need the routine since my wife passed away." DeAndre let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Family business," he echoed, shaking his head slowly. "That is exactly the problem here, Harry. You think because Chloe is my wife that you have some sort of right to exist in my space. You think you can just wander the halls of my building playing rent-a-cop and feeding off my success. Let us be very clear right now. This is my company. I built the modern infrastructure. I secured the international accounts. You are just a pathetic old man clinging to his daughter's coattails because you have absolutely nothing else in your sad little life." The harsh words hit me deep in my chest. They were calculated to break me. They were meant to make me feel small and completely worthless. I looked at his smug face. I looked at the framed photographs on his wall. There were pictures of him shaking hands with politicians. There were pictures of him drinking champagne on a yacht. There was not a single picture of my beautiful daughter Chloe. There was not a single picture of my 3-year-old grandson Leo. My hands began to tremble. I gripped the white envelope so tightly that the thick paper crumpled in my fist. DeAndre saw my hands shaking, and a nasty smirk spread across his face. He thought I was terrified. He thought I was panicking about how I would pay my rent or buy my groceries. He thought he had just crushed the spirit of a helpless old man. But I was not trembling from fear. I was trembling from an agonizing, blinding irony. The righteous indignation of a father was boiling hot in my veins. My heart pounded against my ribs like a sledgehammer. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to slam my fists onto that $20,000 desk and scream the truth into his arrogant face. I wanted to tell him that the skyscraper he was sitting in was bought with my blood and sweat. I wanted to tell him that the chair he was sitting in was paid for by the miles I drove through terrible snowstorms in the dead of winter. I wanted to tell him that his multi-million-dollar salary was a direct result of my silent sacrifice. But most of all, I wanted to tell him that the blind trust controlling 85% of the voting shares of Miller Global Freight was entirely in my name. He was the CEO on paper, but I owned the paper. I owned the building. I owned him. But I bit my tongue. I tasted blood, but I kept my mouth shut. The pain in my chest was unbearable because I realized in that exact moment that my daughter was married to a monster. If he could look his own father-in-law in the eye and discard him like a piece of trash over a fabricated lie about muddy boots, what in the world was he doing to my sweet Chloe when the doors were closed at home? The thought made me feel physically sick to my stomach. I realized that this was not just about losing a security job. This was a massive warning sign. This was the universe violently ripping the blindfold off my eyes. I stood there in my cheap polyester uniform, absorbing his hatred. I let him believe he was the untouchable king of the world. I let him believe he had won the battle. "Pack up your locker and leave your badge at the front desk," DeAndre said, turning his attention back to his bright computer screen. "And Harry, do not come crying to Chloe about this. She has enough on her plate dealing with your constant need for attention. If you try to make her feel bad for me, firing you, I will make sure you never see your grandson again. Do we understand each other?" That was the exact moment the profound sadness vanished from my soul. The heartbreak evaporated into thin air. It was instantly replaced by a cold, resolute focus. He had just threatened to take away my grandson. He had just threatened my flesh and blood. He had crossed a dangerous line that no man should ever cross. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with him. I simply nodded my head. "I understand completely, DeAndre," I said. My voice was eerily calm and steady. "I understand exactly how things work now." I turned around and walked out of the lavish corner office. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me. I walked down the long, silent hallway with my head held high. I was no longer the broken old man he thought I was. I was a father preparing for war. He thought he had just fired an insignificant security guard. He had no idea he had just awakened a sleeping giant. The game had just changed, and I was going to make absolutely sure he lost everything. I was not born wearing a tailored suit. I was born with grease on my hands and diesel in my veins. For 20 long years, I was a long-haul trucker. I drove massive freight rigs from coast to coast, hauling steel and produce across the endless American highways. I knew every way station and every cheap diner from Ohio to California. It was a brutally hard life. My bones ached from the vibrating cab and my eyes were permanently bloodshot from staring at the white lines in the dark. But I did it all for my family. I did it for my beautiful wife, Sarah, and our little girl, Chloe. Sarah was the absolute light of my life. She was the woman who packed my lunches and kissed my cheek before I headed out into the freezing winter nights. But life has a cruel way of testing you. When Chloe was just a teenager, Sarah was diagnosed with leukemia. We fought it with everything we had. I sold everything of value just to pay the hospital bills. But the sickness was too strong. When Sarah passed away, a massive part of my soul died with her. I was left completely alone with a grieving teenage daughter and a mountain of medical debt. I did not know how to process that kind of earth-shattering grief, so I poured every single ounce of my sorrow into my work. I stopped sleeping in a real bed. I basically lived inside the cab of my rusted old Peterbilt truck. I drove 18-hour days, pushing myself to the absolute physical limit. When my eyes wanted to close, I drank bitter black coffee and kept driving. I turned my broken heart into fuel. I saved every single penny. Eventually, I bought a second used truck and hired another driver. Then I bought 5 more. Before I even realized what was happening, that one rusted Peterbilt had grown into a massive logistics fleet. I built Miller Global Freight out of pure desperation and grief. I laid the foundation of a multi-million-dollar empire with calloused hands and a completely broken heart. As the company grew into a national powerhouse, my sweet daughter Chloe grew into an incredible young woman. She was 30 years old now and worked as a pediatric nurse. She had her mother's gentle soul and boundless compassion. Chloe spent her days taking care of sick children, never asking for a single dime of my money. She was my greatest pride. Then she met DeAndre Washington. DeAndre was everything I was not. He was incredibly smooth and polished. He had a fancy business administration degree from a prestigious university, and he knew exactly how to talk to wealthy corporate people. He wore tailored suits and expensive cologne. Chloe fell deeply in love with him, and as a father, all I wanted was to see my little girl happy. I wanted to give them the world. I wanted to give them the security and luxury that Sarah and I never got to experience when we were young. When they got married, I made a monumental decision. DeAndre was endlessly ambitious, but I could see very clearly that he had a fragile ego. He wanted to be recognized as a powerful man. He wanted the prestige of being a chief executive officer. I had spent my entire life working in the dirt, and I was tired. I was getting older, and the stress of running a massive corporation was taking a toll on my heart. I wanted to hand the reins over to the next generation. But I also knew that if I simply handed DeAndre the company, he would feel like he was living in my shadow. So I went to my lawyers and I did something drastic. I placed my entire 85% ownership of Miller Global Freight into a highly guarded blind trust. On paper, DeAndre was appointed as the sole chief executive officer of the company. He was given the massive corner office, the ridiculous salary, and all the public glory. I made sure his name was the only one printed in the business magazines. I completely removed myself from the executive board. I let him believe that he was the absolute king of the castle, but I could not bring myself to stay away completely. I tried playing golf, and I tried sitting at home reading books, but the silence of my empty house was deafening. I missed the smell of the loading docks. I missed the rumble of the diesel engines firing up at dawn. I needed a reason to get out of bed every day. So I went down to the human resources department of my own company, and I quietly applied for a job as a night shift security guard. The hiring manager was a new kid who had absolutely no idea who I was. He just saw an old man looking for minimum wage work and handed me a cheap polyester uniform. For 2 years, I walked the quiet halls of the Miller Global Freight headquarters under the cover of darkness. I checked the locks on the doors and I greeted the late-night warehouse workers. It gave me a profound sense of peace. I was able to stay close to my life work, and I was able to keep a quiet, invisible eye on the company I built from nothing. I watched DeAndre parade around during the daytime in his expensive suits, barking orders at the staff. I stayed out of his way, and I let him play his role. I sacrificed my own pride so that my son-in-law could feel important, and my daughter could have a perfect life. I thought I was doing the right thing. I truly believed that my silent sacrifices were protecting my family. I never once imagined that giving a man that much unchecked power would turn him into a monster. I never imagined that the empire I built with my own blood and sweat would be used as a weapon against the only family I had left. The transformation of DeAndre Washington did not happen overnight. It was not a sudden explosion of anger or a singular event that ruined everything. It was a slow and silent poison. It was a creeping darkness that slowly infected my daughter's marriage. At first, it was just small comments. A sigh of annoyance when Chloe wore something he thought was too casual. A rolling of his eyes when she talked about her long shifts at the pediatric ward. But as the months turned into years and his power at the company grew, his true colors began to show completely. The mask of the perfect son-in-law melted away, and what was left underneath was a deeply arrogant and controlling man. He became absolutely obsessed with status and public image. despite the fact that he was pulling in a multi-million-dollar salary, a salary that was entirely funded by the freight empire I built with my own two hands. He began to systematically strip away my daughter's independence. Chloe loved being a pediatric nurse. She loved helping sick children. It was her passion. But DeAndre forced her to quit. He told her it was embarrassing for the wife of a high-profile chief executive officer to be emptying bedpans and working double shifts for a modest paycheck. He told her she needed to stay home and focus on raising their son Leo and hosting dinner parties for his wealthy new friends. But forcing her to quit her job was only the beginning. Once she no longer had her own income, DeAndre tightened his grip on her life like a vice. He cut off her access to their joint bank accounts. He canceled her primary credit cards and replaced them with a single prepaid debit card. He put my 30-year-old daughter on a strict weekly allowance like she was a child. He demanded receipts for every single gallon of milk and every single box of diapers she bought. If she spent even $10 over her limit, he would give her the silent treatment for days. I will never forget the afternoon I found her crying in the parking lot of a grocery store. I had just finished my shift and went to pick up a few things. I saw her sitting in her car sobbing over the steering wheel. Her debit card had been declined at the register while she was trying to buy formula and winter clothes for baby Leo. The cashier had looked at her with pity, and the people in line had whispered. When I tapped on her window, she jumped. She was absolutely terrified. I paid for her groceries and I begged her to let me talk to him. I wanted to drive straight to his fancy office and break his jaw, but she grabbed my arm and pleaded with me not to make a scene. She told me the company was just going through a stressful quarter and DeAndre was just feeling the pressure. She was defending the very man who was breaking her. The financial abuse was terrible, but the isolation was even worse. DeAndre began to build a golden cage around Chloe and Leo. He alienated her from her oldest friends, claiming they were not sophisticated enough to be associated with their family anymore. And then he turned his sights on me. To DeAndre, my working-class roots were not a badge of honor. They were a contagious disease that he was terrified he might catch. He treated my history as a long-haul trucker like a dirty family secret. He stopped inviting me to their house. The massive, beautiful estate in the expensive suburbs that my money had quietly paid for was suddenly off-limits to me. He told Chloe that my old pickup truck was an eyesore parked in their driveway. He said my rough hands and my loud laugh did not fit in with the country club neighbors. If I wanted to see my daughter or my grandson, it had to be on his strict terms. He limited their visits to my small, modest neighborhood. He claimed the area was not safe enough for his son. I was only allowed to see my own flesh and blood for 1 or 2 hours on alternating Sunday afternoons. And even then, DeAndre would constantly text Chloe demanding to know exactly when she was bringing the boy home. Watching my daughter fade away was the most agonizing experience of my entire life. Chloe used to be so vibrant. She used to have a smile that could light up a dark room. She used to laugh from deep in her chest. But under his control, she became a terrified shadow of her former self. She started walking on eggshells. She would constantly check her phone with trembling hands, terrified of missing one of his calls or texts. She lost weight. The bright spark in her eyes was completely extinguished. As a father, there is absolutely no pain quite like watching a man crush the spirit of your little girl. I had wrestled heavy machinery and fought my way through blinding blizzards on dangerous mountain passes. I knew how to fight physical threats, but I felt completely paralyzed against this kind of psychological warfare. I had promised to step back. I had promised to let them build their own lives. I thought I was giving them a beautiful world by handing him the keys to the kingdom. I thought the blind trust would protect his pride and ensure their happiness. Instead, I realized with a sickening twist in my stomach that I had handed him a loaded weapon, and he was using that weapon to hold my daughter hostage. Every single night when I put on that cheap polyester security uniform and walked the quiet floors of Miller Global Freight, my blood boiled. I walked past the portraits of DeAndre hanging in the lobby. I saw the way the employees bowed down to him. I watched him parade around acting like a king, knowing exactly the kind of tyrant he was behind closed doors. The disrespect was a cancer, and it was spreading fast. The righteous indignation burned deep inside my chest. I knew I could not stay silent forever. I just needed the right moment to strike. I pulled my old Ford pickup truck into the employee parking lot at exactly 11:45 at night. It was my final shift. The air was bitterly cold, and a heavy winter frost covered the windshield. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just staring up at the massive glass and steel building of Miller Global Freight. I built that 50-story tower. Every single pane of glass and every pound of steel was paid for by the miles I drove and the sweat on my back. But tonight, I was just Harry the fired security guard. I reached over to the passenger seat and grabbed my thermos. It was the same scratch silver thermos my late wife Sarah used to fill with hot black coffee before my long cross-country runs. Tonight it felt incredibly heavy in my hands. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the grand lobby and nodded to the young kid working the front reception desk. I went down to the basement locker room and put on that cheap, scratchy polyester uniform for the very last time. I pinned the plastic name badge to my chest, knowing I had to turn it in by sunrise. I started my patrol on the ground floor, walking past the massive loading docks. The deep rumble of the diesel engines idling in the yard usually brought me a profound sense of peace. It was the heartbeat of my life work. But tonight, that sound made my stomach turn. I kept hearing DeAndre Washington speaking to me in that arrogant, mocking tone. I kept seeing the smug, nasty look on his face when he tossed the termination envelope at my work boots. He fired me over an imaginary smudge of dirt on his expensive carpet. He humiliated me in the office I paid for. But the insult to my pride was not what kept me awake. It was what he said about my family. He threatened to take my 3-year-old grandson, Leo, away from me if I dared to comfort my own daughter. A father can endure a massive amount of pain. A father can swallow his pride and take insults from a sharp-suited corporate bully if it keeps the peace. But the moment you threaten a helpless child, the game changes completely. As I rode the freight elevator up to the executive floors, a cold and terrifying clarity washed over me. I realized I was not just packing up my locker and walking away. I could not just disappear into the night and leave my sweet Chloe trapped in a waking nightmare. My gut instinct was screaming at me. Every hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up. Something was deeply wrong inside this company. DeAndre was too confident. He was acting completely untouchable. Men like him do not just abuse their wives emotionally and stop there. They leave a long trail of poison everywhere they go. His arrogance was a shield covering up something rotten. I knew it in my bones. I stepped out of the elevator onto the 50th floor. The executive suite was pitch black. The only light came from the red exit signs glowing at the end of the long, silent hallway. I walked slowly past the massive corner office where DeAndre ruled his fake kingdom. I did not go inside. I did not care about the physical papers on his fancy mahogany desk. I knew that the real secrets of a modern multinational logistics corporation were not kept in a desk drawer. They were buried deep inside the digital veins of the building. I walked past his office and headed straight for the heavy glass double doors of the central data server room. As a standard security guard, my plastic key card only gave me access to the outer hallway. I was supposed to just shine my heavy flashlight through the glass check for electrical fires and keep walking on my patrol. But I was not just a security guard tonight. I was the ghost who built this entire machine from the ground up. When I stepped back from the company and put my 85% ownership into the blind trust, I handed over all the daily operations. I let DeAndre sign the massive checks and make the flashy public speeches. I let him hire fancy information technology experts to build a state-of-the-art cybersecurity network. But I was not a fool. You do not survive 20 harsh years in the trucking business by handing over the keys to your only rig without keeping a spare set hidden in your pocket. I stood in front of the secure electronic keypad next to the server room doors. The red light blinked at me, warning me to stay out. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes for a second. I thought about Chloe crying in her car at the grocery store. I thought about little Leo growing up thinking his grandfather abandoned him. I opened my eyes and reached out with my calloused index finger. I did not scan my cheap plastic badge. Instead, I typed in a 7-digit numerical sequence on the glowing keypad. It was not a standard security code. It was the exact date my beautiful wife Sarah passed away. It was the master override code I had the original network architects secretly hardwire into the foundation of the building mainframe years ago. DeAndre never knew it existed. The red light instantly turned green. The heavy magnetic locks released with a loud, solid click that echoed down the empty hallway. I pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped into the freezing cold server room. The massive black towers of hard drives hummed loudly all around me, blowing icy conditioned air directly onto my face. The room smelled like ozone and electricity. I walked straight to the central administrative terminal hidden in the back corner of the room. The monitor was completely black. I pulled out the cold metal chair and sat down. I placed my scratched silver thermos on the desk next to the mechanical keyboard. I cracked my knuckles, feeling the familiar ache in my joints from decades of hard manual labor. I pressed the power button on the main tower. The large screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow over my tired face. A prompt appeared on the screen asking for a username and a password. DeAndre thought he controlled absolutely everything in this company. He thought he was the ultimate authority in this building, but the original system architects knew exactly who signed their massive paychecks. I placed my rough hands on the keyboard. I typed in the word chairman. Then I typed in a highly complex alphanumeric password that I had memorized over a decade ago and never written down on a single piece of paper. For a terrifying second, the screen froze. I held my breath. I wondered if DeAndre had somehow found the hidden back door during a routine security sweep and sealed it shut. I wondered if I was completely locked out of my own empire and left with absolutely nothing to fight back with. The silence in the room was deafening. But then, the screen flashed a bright, solid green. A small text box appeared dead in the center of the monitor. It read, "Welcome back, Mr. Miller. Full executive access granted." I let out a long, slow breath that I did not realize I was holding. I was inside. I had bypassed every single firewall and advanced security protocol DeAndre had spent millions of company dollars installing. I now had total unrestricted access to every corporate email, every hidden financial transaction, and every deleted file in the entire global network. The system was completely mine. DeAndre thought he could treat me like a piece of trash and kick me out into the street, but all he did was force me into the shadows where I could see everything he was trying to hide. I took a sip of my bitter black coffee from the silver thermos. I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. The righteous anger burning in my chest began to cool into a sharp, deadly focus. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was no longer a silent father stepping aside for the next generation. I was an angry bear waking up from a long winter sleep. I started opening the hidden server directories one by one. I began to pull the digital threads of his fake perfect life. I was a father on a desperate mission to save his daughter, and I was fully prepared to dig through the digital dirt all night until my fingers bled. The final night shift was supposed to be my quiet, pathetic farewell to the company I loved. Instead, it became the exact moment I loaded my weapon and prepared for total war. The glowing green text on the screen reflected in my tired eyes as I navigated through the complex financial directories of Miller Global Freight. I was not an accountant by trade, but I knew exactly how to read a balance sheet. I knew how much a gallon of diesel cost, and I knew how much a heavy-duty truck tire cost. I knew the exact profit margins of my own company because I had built it from the dirt up. But the numbers I was looking at right now did not make any logical sense. There were massive bleed-outs in the quarterly budgets. Millions of dollars were being siphoned away from the core operations and funneled into vague administrative categories. My heart pounded heavy and steady in my chest as I clicked on a restricted folder labeled External Consulting Fees. What I found inside that folder was the very first layer of a massive, disgusting betrayal. I scrolled down a long list of payments and my eyes locked onto a familiar name, Jamal Washington. Jamal was DeAndre's older brother. I remember Jamal very clearly from the family gatherings. He was a loud, arrogant man who always wore clothes that were way too tight and way too expensive. He had never held down a real job in his entire life. He was always chasing some fake investment scheme or bragging about money he did not actually have. But according to the official payroll records of my company, Jamal Washington was currently employed as a senior logistics strategist. I stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. The man did not know the difference between a spark plug and a steering wheel. He had never driven a rig. He had never managed a busy loading dock. He had absolutely zero experience in the freight industry. Yet DeAndre was paying his older brother an annual salary of $300,000. It was a phantom position. Jamal was a ghost employee. He was receiving massive direct deposits every 2 weeks paid for by the sweat of my honest drivers. I sat back in the cold metal chair and let the nauseating reality of that wash over me. I thought about the men and women who drove my trucks through the freezing rain in the middle of the dark night. I thought about the mechanics who broke their backs changing heavy diesel engines on concrete floors. They worked 60-hour weeks just to feed their families and keep a roof over their heads. And here was Jamal Washington sitting on his couch doing absolutely nothing and collecting $300,000 a year of my money. I remembered the last Thanksgiving dinner we all had together. Jamal had shown up wearing a solid gold watch. He had laughed at my old pickup truck parked outside. He told me I needed to upgrade my life and stop living like a peasant. My blood boiled hot in my veins. He bought that gold watch with my money. He was mocking the very man who was unknowingly funding his pathetic fake lifestyle. But the parasitic greed of the Washington family did not stop with Jamal. I leaned closer to the monitor and opened another restricted folder. This one was labeled Corporate Real Estate and Client Hospitality. We used to keep a few modest hotel accounts for when our drivers got stranded in bad weather or needed a safe place to sleep. But the expenses in this folder were astronomical. I found a recurring monthly charge for a luxury penthouse apartment in Manhattan. The lease was $50,000 a month. It was categorized as an executive retreat for entertaining high-value international clients. I clicked on the lease agreement to see who the primary resident actually was. The name on the digital document hit me like a physical punch to the jaw. It was Tasha Washington, DeAndre's younger sister. Tasha was a vicious and superficial woman. She had always treated my sweet daughter Chloe with a subtle, cutting cruelty. She would make backhanded compliments about Chloe's clothes or her hair at family events. She acted like she was royalty and Chloe was just the hired help. I dug deeper into the corporate credit card statements linked to that Manhattan penthouse. The screen filled with endless pages of disgusting charges. Thousands of dollars spent at designer clothing stores in New York. Massive bills from five-star restaurants and exclusive nightclubs. Spa treatments and expensive imported wine. Tasha was living the life of a billionaire heiress in the middle of the city, and she was doing it entirely on the company dime. She was using the corporate hospitality budget as her own personal piggy bank to fund a life she never earned. The stark contrast between Tasha's stolen luxury and my daughter's forced poverty made me feel physically sick to my stomach. I remembered finding Chloe crying in her car at the grocery store because her prepaid debit card was declined. My beautiful daughter, who actually owned a massive piece of this empire through her birthright, was crying over the price of baby formula. She was clipping coupons and wearing old sweaters. Meanwhile, DeAndre's sister was sipping expensive champagne on a penthouse balcony overlooking Central Park. DeAndre had convinced Chloe that the company was struggling. He had told her they needed to tighten their belts and cut back on household expenses. He put my daughter on a strict, agonizing budget and isolated her from the world. He made her feel like a massive burden for simply wanting to buy warm winter clothes for her own child, all while he was secretly funneling millions of dollars to his lazy, arrogant siblings. They were leeches. They were blood-sucking parasites who had attached themselves to the healthy body of Miller Global Freight, and they were draining it dry. DeAndre had brought his entire family into my house and let them feast on the harvest I had planted. He had turned the company I built to protect my daughter into a personal cash machine for his greedy relatives. The betrayal ran so much deeper than just a bad chief executive officer stealing a little off the top. This was a coordinated, systematic attack on my legacy. They looked at me and saw a stupid, uneducated old truck driver. They thought I was completely oblivious. They thought they could just smile in my face at the wedding and then quietly rob me blind in the dark. I closed my eyes and pictured the rusted old Peterbilt truck I started this company with. I remembered the agonizing nights I spent sleeping across the front seats, freezing in the winter because I could not afford to keep the heater running. I remembered the promises I made to my late wife Sarah before she passed away. I promised her I would build something that would keep our little girl safe forever. I had traded my youth, my health, and my happiness to build this financial fortress. I missed out on so many moments of my life just to make sure my family would never have to struggle. I did not do all of that hard work so a man like Jamal could buy gold watches, and a woman like Tasha could play pretend high society. The righteous anger inside me was no longer a wild fire. It was a cold, sharp blade. I did not feel sad anymore. I did not feel pity for DeAndre or his family. I felt a deep primal urge to protect my own flesh and blood. I started pressing keys on the keyboard rapidly. I began downloading every single document I could find. I copied the phantom payroll records for Jamal. I copied the Manhattan lease agreements and the designer credit card statements for Tasha. I saved every digital signature and every illegal wire transfer into a secure encrypted folder on a hidden flash drive. I was building a massive, unshakable wall of evidence. They thought they were so incredibly smart. They thought their expensive business degrees and their fancy suits made them invincible, but they were sloppy. They were arrogant and careless because they truly believed nobody was watching them. They forgot that the man who built the building knows exactly where all the pipes are hidden. I sat alone in the freezing server room surrounded by the humming machines. The cold air blew across the back of my neck, but I was sweating. I had pulled back the first layer of the rotten truth, but my gut told me there was still more to find. A man who is willing to steal millions of dollars to fund his family is usually hiding something even darker for himself. I took another drink of the cold, bitter coffee from my thermos. The caffeine and the adrenaline coursed through my veins, keeping me completely alert and hyper-focused. I was a 68-year-old man, but in that moment I felt like a young soldier preparing for a brutal war. I stared at the glowing blue screen, ready to dig even deeper into the digital shadows. I was going to find every single secret DeAndre Washington was hiding, and then I was going to burn his entire fake kingdom to the absolutely ground. The server room was freezing, but sweat was dripping down the back of my neck. I had already uncovered the massive fraud involving DeAndre's siblings, but my gut told me I had not even scratched the surface. I sat in front of the glowing monitor, rubbing my tired eyes. The green light of the screen cast a pale shadow across the room. I opened the main directory and noticed a hidden drive. It was completely buried under layers of fake system files. A normal information technology worker would have completely ignored it. But I knew the digital architecture of this building like the back of my own hand. I clicked on the drive. It asked for a secondary encryption key. DeAndre was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. He had locked this specific folder tight. I sat back and thought about how a man like DeAndre operated. He was vain. He was obsessed with status. I typed in his own birth date and the word CEO. The computer beeped. The folder opened instantly. I almost laughed out loud at how utterly predictable he was. But the laughter died in my throat the second I saw the contents of the folder. There were thousands of emails. There were scanned legal documents. There were international banking spreadsheets. I clicked on the very first email thread. It was an exchange between DeAndre and the chief financial officer of my company. Her name was Victoria. Victoria was a sharp woman who drove an expensive imported sports car and always looked at the warehouse workers like they were stray dogs. The emails were not about corporate strategy. They were deeply personal. They were completely disgusting. I read message after message filled with graphic descriptions of the hotel rooms they had booked across the city. I read about the expensive weekend trips they took together while my daughter Chloe was stuck at home alone taking care of baby Leo. DeAndre had been sleeping with his own chief financial officer for over 2 years. The betrayal hit me hard in the chest. My poor sweet Chloe was crying over the price of baby formula while her husband was buying diamond necklaces for another woman using my money. But the infidelity was only the tip of the spear. As I kept reading the emails between DeAndre and Victoria, the true scope of their evil partnership began to take shape. They were not just having a secret affair. They were running a massive coordinated financial operation. Victoria was the gatekeeper of the company treasury. She was the one person who could authorize large international transfers without raising any immediate red flags. I opened a spreadsheet labeled Offshore Asset Allocation. The numbers on the screen were absolutely staggering. For For the past 18 months, DeAndre and Victoria had been systematically draining the liquid cash reserves of Miller Global Freight. They were creating fake invoices from imaginary international shipping partners. They would approve the payments and wire massive sums of money directly into shell companies located in the Cayman Islands. Millions of dollars of honest, hard-earned money were just disappearing into the tropical air. Victoria had set up a complex web of dummy corporations. They used fake consulting fees to justify the massive outflows of cash. They even forged internal security clearances to bypass the auditing software. The audacity of their crimes was sickening. I clicked on the corporate registration documents for the shell companies. They were all registered under completely untraceable corporate entities. But the primary beneficiary listed on the hidden trust agreements was DeAndre Washington. He was robbing his own company blind and packing a massive golden parachute for himself. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. I thought about my truck drivers out there on the dark, icy roads in the middle of the night. They were risking their lives to deliver freight and keep the company profitable. And the man sitting in the corner office was just stealing it all to fund a secret life with his mistress. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I took a deep breath of the cold server room air, trying to steady my racing heart. I had built this empire to provide for my family for generations to come. I had sacrificed my own youth and my own body to make sure my daughter would never have to worry about money. And this man was just burning it all to the ground. He was hollowing out the core of my legacy like a parasite. But the absolute worst was yet to come. I closed the financial spreadsheets and clicked on a folder labeled Domestic Dissolution. My hand hovered over the computer mouse, trembling slightly. I knew exactly what the word dissolution meant. I opened the folder and found a highly detailed legal document prepared by a very expensive downtown law firm. It was a draft for a divorce petition. DeAndre was planning to blindside my daughter. He had every single detail meticulously planned out. I read through the thick legal paragraphs and my blood ran absolutely cold. He was not just planning to leave Chloe. He was planning to completely destroy her. According to the documents, DeAndre and Victoria had deliberately taken out massive high-interest loans using the domestic operating accounts of Miller Global Freight. Because DeAndre had secretly manipulated the corporate structure over the past year, he had managed to attach my daughter's name as a secondary guarantor on several of these toxic domestic accounts. The plan was brilliant and purely evil. He was going to file for divorce and simultaneously declare domestic bankruptcy for the company. He would claim that the logistics market had collapsed. He would take his hidden millions in the Cayman Islands and walk away clean. And he was going to leave Chloe holding the bag. My beautiful, innocent daughter, who spent her days taking care of sick children at the hospital, was going to be hit with millions of dollars in corporate debt. She would be completely ruined. The banks would take her house. They would take her car. They would garnish any wages she ever earned for the rest of her life. She would be crushed under a mountain of financial ruin, while the man who caused it all sat on a beach drinking cocktails with his mistress. He was setting her up to be the ultimate sacrificial lamb. The pure malice required to do something like that to the mother of your own child was entirely beyond my comprehension. I sat there in the dark, staring at the screen, feeling my heart break into a million tiny pieces for my daughter. I remembered the day she was born. I remembered holding her tiny little hand in the hospital ward. I had promised the universe that I would always protect her from the evil in the world. And now the greatest evil imaginable was sleeping right next to her in her own bed. I thought I had reached the absolute bottom of his depravity, but I was entirely wrong. I scrolled down to the custody section of the divorce petition. This was where DeAndre revealed the true depth of his black soul. He was not just going to leave Chloe with massive debt. He was going to take my grandson away. The legal documents outlined a vicious strategy to claim full and exclusive custody of 3-year-old Leo. DeAndre had instructed his lawyers to use Chloe's sudden, devastating financial collapse as proof that she was an unfit mother. He was going to paint her as unstable and completely incapable of providing a safe home for the boy. He even had fake statements drafted, claiming that her depression over the divorce made her a danger to the child. My hands gripped the edge of the metal desk so hard my knuckles turned completely white. Leo was the absolute light of my life. He had my late wife Sarah's bright eyes and her sweet smile. I remembered how little Leo would run up to me and grab my legs when I came to visit. He would hold up his little toy trucks and ask me to play with him on the floor. He was just a baby. He did not understand greed or malice. He just wanted to be loved. Every time I looked at that little boy, I saw the future of our family. DeAndre did not even care about Leo. He ignored the boy completely when he was at home. He treated his own son like a prop for family photographs and nothing more. So why would he spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on vicious lawyers just to take custody away from a mother who loved her child more than life itself? The answer was in a separate email sent from DeAndre to his lawyer. I opened the message and read it twice just to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. DeAndre wrote that he knew Chloe was incredibly close to her father. He wrote that the old man, meaning me, probably had a decent blue-collar pension saved up after driving trucks for 40 years. DeAndre's ultimate master plan was to use Leo as a hostage. He was going to hold custody of my grandson over my head and force me to empty out my entire life savings to pay off Chloe's legal bills. He wanted to extort every last single dime of my retirement money. He thought I was just a tired old security guard with a modest pension and a little house in the suburbs. He wanted to squeeze me completely dry and leave my entire family destitute in the gutter. He wanted to take my daughter, my grandson, my dignity, and my future. I stopped reading. I slowly let go of the computer mouse. The silence in the freezing server room was incredibly heavy. For a long time, I just sat there breathing the cold, manufactured air. Earlier this morning, when he fired me, I had felt a burning, righteous anger. I had wanted to scream and yell and throw things, but what I felt right now was entirely different. The burning anger was completely gone. The sorrow, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it all just evaporated into the dark room. My heart stopped racing. It slowed down into a deep, steady, and terrifying rhythm. My chest felt hollow and completely numb. I was no longer a sad grandfather watching his family fall apart. I was no longer an old man worried about his daughter. The sadness was completely gone. My heart had turned into a solid block of freezing ice. I stared at the glowing green screen and I made a silent promise to the universe. I promised that DeAndre Washington was going to pay for every single tear he had ever caused my daughter to shed. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a helpless old fool. He thought he had already won the match before I even realized we were playing. But he had made one fatal miscalculation. He had absolutely no idea who he was actually dealing with. He thought my money was just a little pension from driving trucks. He had no idea that I held the absolute supreme power over the very corporate empire he was trying to steal. He did not know that I could crush his entire existence with a single phone call. I reached over and picked up my scratched silver thermos. The coffee inside was completely cold, but I drank it anyway. I needed the bitter taste to remind me that this was real. I began to download every single piece of evidence. I copied the divorce papers, the custody plans, the offshore bank records, and the graphic emails with his mistress. I saved everything onto a high-capacity encrypted flash drive that I carried on my keychain. I watched the progress bar on the screen slowly fill up, knowing that every single megabyte of data was another nail in his coffin. I was going to let him keep playing his game. I was going to let him believe his master plan was working perfectly. I would let him stand in front of the board of directors and smile his arrogant smile. But when the time was perfectly right, I was going to rip the entire world out from under his expensive Italian shoes. The sorrow ends here. The mourning for the family I thought we had is completely over. The war begins right now. And I am going to make absolutely sure that I am the only one left standing when the dust finally clears. The sun began to rise over my quiet suburban neighborhood, casting a pale gray light through the kitchen window. I had not slept a single second. I sat at my small wooden kitchen table staring at the small black flash drive resting next to my cold cup of coffee. That tiny piece of plastic held the entire digital footprint of a monster. It held the offshore bank accounts, the fake consulting contracts, the graphic emails with his mistress, and the devastating divorce papers he planned to hit my daughter with. I picked up the flash drive and squeezed it tightly in the palm of my hand. The sharp plastic edges dug into my calloused skin, but I welcomed the pain. It grounded me. It reminded me that the nightmare I uncovered in the freezing server room last night was absolutely real. For the past 2 years, I had played the role of the quiet, obedient night shift security guard. I had swallowed my pride and let my son-in-law, DeAndre Washington, parade around the city pretending to be a self-made billionaire. I had allowed him to treat me like dirt because I thought it was the price I had to pay to keep my daughter Chloe happy. But Chloe was not happy. She was living in a golden cage, terrified and financially abused by a man who was secretly robbing her blind. DeAndre had mistaken my silent sacrifice for weakness. He thought I was just a tired old truck driver who got lucky. Today, I was going to remind him exactly who built the castle he was living in. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked down the short hallway to my bedroom. The cheap polyester security uniform was lying in a crumpled heap on the floor, right where I had dropped it when I got home. I kicked it out of the way with my heavy work boot. I walked over to the sliding closet doors and opened them. I pushed past my flannel work shirts and my old denim jackets. Deep in the very back of the closet, hanging inside a thick protective garment bag, was a piece of my past that I had not touched in a decade. I unzipped the bag and pulled out a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. I bought this suit in Milan 10 years ago after securing my first major international freight contract. It was made of the finest Italian wool, and it fit the broad shoulders of a working man perfectly. I carefully took off my worn-out clothes and put on the crisp white dress shirt. I tied the dark silk tie. I slipped into the matching suit jacket and buttoned it. Finally, I took off my heavy work boots and put on a pair of polished black leather Oxford shoes. I stood in front of the full-length mirror on the back of the bedroom door and looked at my reflection. The tired, sad old man who had walked out of DeAndre's office yesterday morning was completely gone. The man staring back at me now was cold and dangerous. The calluses on my hands were still there, but now they were wrapped in pure corporate power. I was no longer Harry the pathetic security guard. I was Harrison Miller, the founder and majority shareholder of Miller Global Freight. And I was going to war. I grabbed my keys and walked out to the driveway. I did not own a luxury sports car. I still drove the same beat-up blue Ford pickup truck I had owned for 15 years. I climbed into the cab and started the engine. The loud rumble of the old motor matched the heavy beating of my heart. I pulled out of my quiet suburban street and headed toward the massive skyline of downtown Chicago. The morning traffic was heavy, but I navigated the busy highways with the aggressive precision of a man who had driven heavy freight rigs for 20 years. My destination was a towering skyscraper made of black glass and steel located in the financial district. This building was the headquarters of the most ruthless and expensive corporate law firm in the entire Midwest. I pulled my dusty Ford pickup truck into the immaculate underground parking garage. I parked it right between a brand new Porsche and a silver Mercedes. I turned off the engine and stepped out. The contrast between my old truck and my expensive tailored suit was jarring, but I did not care. I walked toward the private executive elevators with absolute purpose. I rode the elevator up to the 60th floor. When the polished metal doors opened, I stepped into a massive lobby covered in white marble and modern art. Behind a sleek glass reception desk sat a young woman wearing a headset. She looked up at me with a polite but firm, professional smile. The firm did not take walk-in appointments. They represented billionaire investors and multinational conglomerates. "Good morning, sir," the receptionist said. "Do you have a scheduled appointment with one of our partners today?" I walked right up to the glass desk and looked her dead in the eye. "I do not have an appointment," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I need to see Evelyn Hayes immediately. Tell her Harrison Miller is standing in her lobby." The young woman hesitated. She typed something into her computer and frowned. "Mr. Miller, I am sorry, but Miss Hayes is currently preparing for a major federal court hearing. Her schedule is completely blocked for the entire month. If you would like, I can try to set up a consultation with one of our junior associates for next week." I leaned slightly over the glass desk. My presence was large and imposing. "You do not understand," I said calmly. "I am not asking for a consultation. I am telling you to pick up your phone right now and tell Evelyn Hayes that Harrison Miller is here. If she tells you she is too busy, I will turn around and walk out that door, and I will take the largest retainer in the history of this firm with me." The receptionist swallowed hard. Her professional smile vanished completely. She could see the absolute unwavering authority in my eyes. She quickly picked up her desk phone and pressed a speed dial button. She spoke softly into the receiver. A few seconds later, her eyes went wide. She hung up the phone and stood up from her chair. "Miss Hayes will see you right now. Mr. Miller," she said, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors at the end of the long hallway. "Please go right in." I walked down the quiet corridor. The thick plush carpet completely absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I reached the massive double doors at the end of the hall and pushed them open without knocking. The corner office was spectacular. It had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the freezing waters of Lake Michigan. Standing behind a massive marble desk was Evelyn Hayes. Evelyn was a 55-year-old woman with sharp features, piercing blue eyes, and silver hair pulled back into a tight, strict bun. She was the most brilliant and terrifying corporate attorney in Chicago. She was the absolute master of contract law and the exact architect who had designed the impenetrable blind trust protecting my 85% ownership of Miller Global Freight. When I walked into the room, Evelyn immediately stopped what she was doing. She dropped her gold pen onto the desk. She looked at my face and she looked at the tailored charcoal suit I was wearing. For the past 2 years, she had only seen me in my casual retirement clothes or my security uniform when I stopped by to sign routine tax documents. Seeing me dressed for war sent a very clear message. Evelyn did not offer me a warm greeting. She did not ask how I was doing. She simply stood up at perfect attention. "Harry," she said, her voice sharp and serious. "You look like a man who is ready to burn a city to the ground. What exactly has happened?" I walked over to her desk and pulled the black encrypted flash drive out of my jacket pocket. I tossed it onto the smooth marble surface. The small piece of plastic slid across the desk and stopped right in front of her folded hands. "I need you to cancel every single meeting you have for the next 2 weeks. "Evelyn," I said, sitting down heavily in the leather chair across from her, "I am taking my company back, and I am going to utterly destroy the man who is currently sitting in the chief executive chair." Evelyn sat down slowly. She did not touch the flash drive yet. She looked at me with intense predatory curiosity. "DeAndre Washington?" she asked. "I always told you that boy was a walking liability, Harry. I told you letting him run the daily operations without direct oversight was a massive risk. What did he do?" I leaned forward and rested my elbows on my knees. "He fired me yesterday morning," I said. My voice was eerily calm. "He called me into his office and fired me from my minimum wage security job because he thought my boots were dirty. He called me a pathetic old man." Evelyn let out a short, dry laugh. "He fired the majority shareholder," she said, shaking her head. "The boy is an absolute fool. But you did not put on a custom Italian suit and barge into my office just because your son-in-law insulted your pride. What is on the drive, Harry?" I looked out the massive window at the gray skyline. "He is stealing from me, Evelyn. He has his brother Jamal on the payroll for $300,000 a year as a fake consultant. He has his sister Tasha living in a $50,000 a month Manhattan penthouse charged to our corporate hospitality account. But that is just the pocket change." I turned my attention back to Evelyn. Her eyes were locked onto mine. She was listening intently, analyzing every single word. "He is sleeping with Victoria, our chief financial officer," I continued. "Together, they have been draining our domestic liquid reserves and wiring millions of dollars into shell companies in the Cayman Islands. They are deliberately loading the domestic operating accounts with toxic high-interest debt, and he secretly attached my daughter's name as a secondary guarantor to those accounts." Evelyn's expression darkened completely. The professional detachment vanished. The legal shark inside her smelled blood in the water. "He is setting up a corporate bankruptcy," she said, her mind already connecting the complex legal dots. "He plans to crash the domestic side, wash the stolen assets through the offshore shells, and leave your daughter holding the bag for the toxic debt." "Exactly," I said. "But it gets much worse. The drive contains drafted divorce papers. He is going to blindside Chloe, and he plans to use the financial ruin he deliberately created to prove she is an unfit mother. He is going to take full legal custody of my 3-year-old grandson Leo. And he explicitly told his lawyer he plans to use the boy as a hostage to extort my retirement pension to pay for Chloe's legal defense. For a long, quiet moment, Evelyn Hayes said absolutely nothing. She reached out and picked up the black flash drive. She held it delicately between her manicured fingers as if it were a highly explosive bomb. In her world of corporate law, she had seen massive greed and terrible betrayals. But the pure, calculated malice of a man trying to destroy his own wife and sell his own child for leverage was a special kind of evil. Evelyn plugged the drive into her secure terminal. She typed in her access credentials. I gave her the decryption password and she opened the master folder. For the next hour, we sat in absolute silence as Evelyn scrolled through the offshore bank records, the fake invoices, the phantom payroll documents, and the sickening emails. I watched her face. Evelyn was a woman made of ice, but I could see the genuine disgust flashing in her eyes. When she finally finished reading the divorce petition, she gently pushed her keyboard away. She looked up at me and took a deep breath. "Harry," she said softly, "I have been practicing corporate law for 30 years. I have ruined men for far less than this. What DeAndre and Victoria have committed is textbook wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and massive breach of fiduciary duty. If we hand this to the federal authorities right now, they will both be arrested by dinner time." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "Arresting him today is entirely too easy. If we call the authorities right now, his lawyers will spin a narrative. They will claim he made bad investments. They will drag this out in the courts for years, and he will use the time to hide the Cayman money. He wants to play a massive public game, so we are going to let him play." Evelyn smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. "You want to execute him publicly?" she said. "You want to do it at the annual shareholder meeting next month." "I want to take everything from him," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I want to freeze every single asset he has, including the offshore accounts, before he even knows we are watching. I want to lock down his brother's bank accounts, and I want his sister thrown out of that penthouse. I want to build an invisible steel cage around his entire life. And when he stands up at that shareholder meeting to announce his fake restructuring plan, I am going to walk into that room and rip his entire world apart." Evelyn pulled a fresh yellow legal pad across her desk and picked up her gold pen. "Waking the sleeping bear was the worst mistake that boy ever made," she said. "We are going to need a team of forensic accountants to trace the Cayman shells. I will draft emergency ex parte injunctions to freeze his personal assets under seal. We will coordinate quietly with my contacts at the Securities and Exchange Commission. We will prepare the termination documents for cause, stripping him of all executive benefits and severances." We spent the next 4 hours mapping out the most brutal legal ambush in the history of Chicago corporate law. Every single move DeAndre made was carefully countered. Every escape route he thought he had was permanently blocked. We built a flawless, impenetrable trap. He thought he was the ultimate predator. But as I sat in that massive corner office planning his absolute destruction, I knew the truth. DeAndre Washington was just a dead man walking, and I was the executioner, waiting patiently in the shadows. The war room inside Evelyn Hayes' law firm became my second home over the next few days. Evelyn did not just hire a standard accountant to look over the books. She brought in a team of elite forensic financial investigators. These were men and women who usually tracked down international money laundering cartels and corrupt politicians. Now they were sitting in a high-tech conference room, dissecting the bleeding veins of Miller Global Freight. I sat at the head of the massive glass table drinking bitter black coffee and watching them work. They had multiple large computer monitors set up projecting endless rows of banking data onto the white walls. It was a strange and sickening feeling to see my entire life work reduced to red and black numbers on a glowing screen. I remember driving my rig through a blinding snowstorm in Montana just to secure the first $100,000 of operational capital for the company. I remembered my hands going completely numb from gripping the freezing steering wheel. Now I was watching these highly paid investigators track how my son-in-law had stolen millions of dollars with a few simple clicks of a computer mouse. The absolute efficiency of his theft was horrifying, but the efficiency of Evelyn's team was a thing of beautiful, terrifying precision. They moved like digital surgeons. Within the first 48 hours, they had completely mapped out the intricate maze of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. They traced every single fake invoice back to DeAndre and his mistress Victoria. But the offshore accounts were just the massive structural fraud. The personal betrayal, the disgusting, everyday greed was found in the domestic accounts used by his brother Jamal and his sister Tasha. I told the investigators to pull every single public social media record associated with Jamal and Tasha Washington. If they were spending my money to live like royalty, I wanted to see exactly how they were parading it around. One of the lead investigators, a young man with sharp eyes and a quiet professional voice, mirrored a social media profile onto the main presentation screen. It belonged to Jamal. The screen filled with high-resolution photographs and videos of a man living a complete fantasy life. There was Jamal standing on the polished wooden deck of a massive white yacht in Miami, holding a bottle of expensive champagne in one hand and a thick imported cigar in the other. He was wearing a loud designer silk shirt completely unbuttoned to show off a massive solid gold chain resting on his chest. I looked closely at the timestamp and the date of the photograph. It was taken on a Tuesday afternoon. On a Tuesday afternoon, my honest truck drivers were hauling heavy loads across the dangerous desert highways, sweating in the brutal heat to meet their delivery quotas. And Jamal, the phantom logistics consultant, who was paid $300,000 a year from my payroll, was getting drunk on a rented luxury yacht. I asked the investigator to pull up the financial records matching that specific date. It took him less than 10 seconds to find the exact corporate wire transfer that paid for the boat rental. It was a $10,000 charge categorized as an executive team building retreat. I stared at the screen, feeling my jaw clench so tight my teeth began to ache. But the photographs were not even the worst part. It was the captions and the comments underneath them. Jamal had posted a video of himself throwing handfuls of cash into the ocean just for laughs. One of his friends had commented asking how he managed to secure such an incredible life without ever clocking into an office. Jamal replied publicly for the entire world to see. He wrote that he had a golden goose that laid diamond eggs. He bragged about how easy it was to manipulate the system when the people at the top were completely clueless. Then another comment caught my eye. Someone asked about his father-in-law, meaning me. Jamal replied with a laughing emoji and typed out the words, "Old broke Harry is too busy playing dress-up in a fake police uniform to notice anything. He is just a sad old truck driver who handed over the keys to the castle because he was too stupid to run it himself." He went on to say that I was entirely pathetic and that my money was much better off in the hands of a real boss like his brother DeAndre. I did not scream. I did not pound my heavy fists on the glass table. I just asked the investigator to print every single screenshot and attach the matching corporate receipts. Every single word Jamal typed was another heavy iron nail in his coffin. Then we moved on to Tasha Washington. The screen shifted to a different social media profile. If Jamal was playing the role of a wealthy music producer, Tasha was playing the role of an elite high society heiress. Her page was an endless stream of pure toxic vanity. There were pictures of her standing in the massive living room of the Manhattan penthouse that my company was paying $50,000 a month to lease. She was showing off her walk-in closets filled with hundreds of pairs of designer shoes and custom handbags. She posted videos from the back seats of chauffeured luxury cars, drinking imported sparkling water and complaining about how exhausting it was to be so fabulous. I watched the young investigators cross-reference the routing numbers. They pulled the metadata from the photographs uploaded to the internet and matched the geographic coordinates to the timestamps on the corporate credit card swipes. It was an undeniable mathematical certainty. Tasha had spent over $400,000 in a single year just on clothes and expensive meals. But just like her brother, her true venom was hidden in the comments. I read a post where Tasha was showing off a brand new diamond tennis bracelet. One of her followers complimented the jewelry and asked if her sister-in-law Chloe had one just like it. Tasha's response made my blood run completely cold. She wrote that spineless Chloe would not know what to do with real jewelry if it hit her in the face. She called my beautiful, gentle daughter a pathetic little mouse, who was lucky that a man like DeAndre even looked in her direction. Tasha boasted that Chloe was too busy clipping grocery coupons and crying over dirty diapers to ever understand true luxury. She publicly mocked the fact that Chloe had to ask DeAndre for permission to buy winter boots for baby Leo, all while Tasha was swiping a stolen platinum credit card to buy diamonds for herself. Reading those words felt like taking a physical knife directly to the heart. My daughter was skipping meals just to save a few dollars. My daughter was crying in the parking lot of a grocery store because her prepaid debit card was declined for baby formula. She was living in a constant state of fear and severe anxiety, believing that her family was on the brink of complete financial ruin. She was sacrificing her own basic needs because DeAndre had convinced her the freight company was struggling to survive. And the entire time, DeAndre's vicious sister was sitting in a $50,000 a month penthouse laughing at her misery and buying diamonds with the money that rightfully belonged to Chloe's family. They were not just stealing my money. They were stealing my daughter's dignity. They were feeding off her deep emotional pain and turning her suffering into an inside joke for their internet friends. The sheer magnitude of their cruelty was almost impossible to comprehend. I looked around the large conference room at the forensic accountants. Even these hardened financial investigators, people who tracked ruthless criminals for a living, looked visibly disgusted by what they were reading. They were completely silent, giving me the space to process the absolute horror of the situation. I closed my eyes and took a deep, slow breath. I let the pain wash over me, and then I let it go. I replaced the sorrow with a freezing cold wave of pure, calculated vengeance. I opened my eyes and looked at the lead investigator. I told him to keep digging. I wanted every single receipt. I wanted every single restaurant bill, every single yacht rental, every single pair of designer shoes, and every single cruel comment completely documented, categorized, and legally notarized. I wanted an ironclad paper trail that no expensive defense lawyer could ever dispute in a court of law. For 5 intense days, we traced the blood money. We followed the digital footprints from the corporate bank accounts all the way to the expensive retail stores and the luxury real estate brokers. Evelyn Hayes sat with me reviewing the massive binders of evidence as they were rapidly assembled. She drafted civil asset forfeiture documents. She prepared the complex legal paperwork to immediately seize the Manhattan penthouse and freeze all the bank accounts associated with Jamal and Tasha. We were building an invisible steel cage around their entire fake lives. They had absolutely no idea that the walls were rapidly closing in. They were completely blinded by their own massive arrogance. They thought they were totally untouchable because they thought they were dealing with a weak, foolish old man. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man whose money they were stealing. A man who spends 20 years driving heavy rigs across the frozen, treacherous mountains of the Midwest does not panic when the road gets dangerous. He drops down into a lower gear and he pushes straight through the storm. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a sudden emotional confrontation. I was not going to call them on the telephone and scream at them. I was going to let them keep posting their pictures. I was going to let them keep popping their expensive champagne and laughing at my sweet daughter. Every single time they swiped that stolen credit card, they were simply tying the heavy rope tighter around their own necks. Every arrogant picture they posted to the internet was a signed, written confession. I watched them dig their own graves on the glowing computer screens, and I felt a profound, dark satisfaction. They loved to show off for the world. They loved the public attention and the fake glamour. So I decided right then and there that I was going to give them the exact massive audience they craved. But it was not going to be on the internet. It was going to be in the executive boardroom in front of every single major shareholder and every single corporate partner of Miller Global Freight. I was going to let them walk into that room thinking they were absolute royalty. And then I was going to lock the heavy wooden doors and drop the sky directly on their heads. I gathered the massive stacks of printed evidence and placed them neatly into a heavy, red leather briefcase. The financial ammunition was fully loaded. The target was firmly locked. The only thing left to do now before the annual meeting was to make sure my daughter and my young grandson were completely safe from the massive collateral damage when the bomb finally went off. The legal trap was completely set, but the most important piece of the puzzle was still out in the open. My daughter Chloe and my young grandson Leo were still living inside the monster's house. I could not drop the heavy hammer of justice on DeAndre Washington, while my own flesh and blood were trapped within his immediate reach. I knew his schedule perfectly because I used to be the one who signed off on his executive itineraries. He was giving a keynote speech at a downtown logistics conference that morning. He would be standing on a brightly lit stage surrounded by news cameras and wealthy corporate executives playing the role of the visionary business leader. This gave me a strict 4-hour window of opportunity. I drove my heavy Ford pickup truck to a discount grocery store located deep in the sprawling suburbs, far away from the wealthy neighborhoods where DeAndre forced my daughter to live. I knew Chloe shopped here every single Thursday morning because it was the only place where her strictly controlled weekly allowance could stretch far enough to buy fresh vegetables and basic baby supplies. I parked my truck near the back of the massive asphalt lot and waited. The sky was heavily overcast, and a bitter winter wind swept across the parking lot, rattling the empty metal shopping carts. I sat in the cold cab of my truck watching the automatic glass entrance doors. After 45 agonizing minutes, I finally saw her. She pulled into the parking lot driving a 10-year-old gray sedan with a noticeable dent in the passenger side door. Her husband was the chief executive officer of a multinational freight empire. He drove a brand new imported luxury sport utility vehicle that cost more than most people's houses. But he forced his own wife to drive a rattling old car, claiming they needed to be financially conservative and humble. It was just another sick method of control. Chloe stepped out of the driver's seat and walked around to the back door to unbuckle little Leo from his car seat. She looked absolutely exhausted. She was wearing an oversized wool sweater that I vividly remembered buying for her 5 years ago before she even met DeAndre. Her thin shoulders were slumped and her beautiful dark hair was tied back in a messy knot. She looked around the open parking lot with quick, nervous glances like a terrified bird constantly looking for a silent predator. She gently placed Leo into the seat of the metal shopping cart and walked slowly toward the sliding doors. My heart physically ached watching her. The righteous anger burned hot in my chest, but I forced myself to stay completely calm. I waited until she was fully inside the grocery store before I opened my truck door and stepped out into the freezing wind. I walked through the sliding doors and navigated the brightly lit aisles, passing colorful displays of cheap processed food and discounted household goods. I finally found her in the baby care aisle located at the very back of the store. She was holding a plastic container of baby formula in one hand and staring intensely at the yellow price tag on the shelf. She held her cheap prepaid debit card in her other hand, moving her lips silently as she calculated the exact pennies in her head. Leo was sitting quietly in the shopping cart holding a small stuffed bear, looking up at his mother with big, innocent brown eyes. I stepped fully into the aisle and softly called her name. Chloe turned around and gasped loudly. For a split second, her face lit up with pure, genuine happiness to see her father. But that happiness was immediately swallowed by a wave of sheer panic. She quickly looked over her shoulder to see if anyone was watching us. "Dad, what are you doing here?" she whispered urgently, her voice trembling with genuine fear. "You cannot be here right now. DeAndre constantly checks the location tracking application on my cell phone. If he knows I am talking to you in person, he will be so angry with me. He told me you were a bad influence on Leo because you are just a security guard. He said you are not allowed to see us anymore unless he is physically present in the room." Hearing those horrible words coming from my own beautiful daughter broke whatever tiny piece of restraint I had left inside my soul. I walked right up to her and gently took the heavy plastic container of baby formula out of her shaking hands. I set it down gently on the metal shelf. Then I wrapped my thick, heavy arms around her thin shoulders and pulled her tightly against my chest. At first, she stayed completely rigid, terrified of breaking the strict rules her abusive husband had burned into her mind. But then the dam completely broke. She collapsed against me, entirely losing all her strength. She buried her face into my old jacket and began to sob uncontrollably. It was a deep, agonizing wail of pure misery that she had been holding deep inside her chest for years. She cried right there in the middle of the discount grocery store aisle, completely ignoring the other shoppers who walked past us. She confessed absolutely everything to me through her heavy tears. She told me about the empty joint bank accounts and the strict evening curfews. She told me about the endless emotional manipulation, the constant belittling, and the terrifying midnight arguments where he would scream inches from her face. But the worst part was the extortion. She sobbed and told me that DeAndre constantly threatened to take little Leo away from her if she ever dared to complain to a divorce lawyer or tell anyone about the abuse. He had convinced her that his massive wealth and powerful corporate connections would easily crush her in any family court. She told me she felt like a completely helpless prisoner trapped inside a nightmare with absolutely no way out. I held her tightly, running my rough, calloused hand over her hair, just like I used to do when she was a little girl scared of the loud summer thunderstorms. I let her cry until there were absolutely no tears left in her tired eyes. Then I gently pushed her back, holding her by the shoulders so she had to look directly into my face. I wiped a wet tear from her pale cheek with my thumb. "Do not be afraid anymore, sweetheart," I said, my voice low and vibrating with absolute certainty. "You do not have to hide anymore because I know absolutely everything. I know about the prepaid debit cards and the tracking applications. I know about his arrogant brother Jamal and his cruel sister Tasha stealing our corporate money to fund their fake luxury lifestyles. I know about his secret mistress Victoria and the millions of dollars they have been hiding in offshore bank accounts down in the Cayman Islands. And I know about the fake bankruptcy and the vicious divorce papers he drafted to try and steal my grandson away from us." Chloe's tired eyes went incredibly wide with absolute shock. She stopped crying instantly. She stared at me, trying desperately to process the massive amount of highly confidential information I had just dropped onto her shoulders. "But how do you know all of that?" she whispered, her voice shaking with confusion. "You are just a security guard, Dad. He makes sure you never see the real paperwork." I offered her a soft, reassuring smile, feeling the absolute power of the truth rising in my chest. "I am not a security guard, Chloe," I told her, keeping my voice completely steady. "I am the absolute majority shareholder of Miller Global Freight. I own 85% of the entire multinational company he works for. I am the true chairman of the board. I placed my ownership into a highly guarded blind trust years ago to give him a fair chance to be a real man and a proud husband to you. But he proved to the world that he is nothing but a greedy, treacherous parasite." I took a deep breath and delivered the ultimate promise of a father to his child. "I spent my whole life moving freight to protect you. Today, I am throwing out the trash." She looked at me, and for the very first time in 3 long years, I saw a genuine bright spark of hope light up in her beautiful eyes. The heavy veil of fear was instantly ripped away. I reached down into the metal shopping cart and lifted my 3-year-old grandson Leo directly into my strong arms. The little boy smiled brightly and wrapped his tiny, warm arms tightly around my neck, resting his head on my shoulder. "We are leaving this place right now," I told Chloe. "Leave the metal shopping cart right here in the aisle. Leave the keys to that dangerous old car right here on the shelf. We are not going back to his massive house to pack any bags or collect any photographs. It is far too dangerous to step foot on his property right now. We have unlimited resources, and we can buy you and Leo whatever clothes and toys you need later today." She did not argue with me. She did not hesitate for a single second. She simply nodded her head, grabbed her purse, and followed me out of the brightly lit store and into the freezing winter wind of the parking lot. I opened the heavy passenger door of my Ford pickup truck and helped her climb up into the warm cab. I securely strapped little Leo into the specialized safety car seat I had installed in the back row, specifically anticipating this exact moment. As I started the loud diesel engine and pulled out onto the busy highway, Chloe asked me where we were going to hide. I explained the next crucial phase of our tactical plan. I told her that we were not just running away like terrified victims. I had already created a massive digital decoy to completely blind her husband. Earlier this morning, Evelyn Hayes and my team of elite forensic investigators had used an untraceable computer to hack directly into DeAndre's shared airline travel rewards account. We deliberately booked a direct first-class flight from Chicago to Miami under Chloe's exact legal name. We paid the massive deposit using one of the few joint credit cards that DeAndre actively monitored on his personal cellular phone. Furthermore, we had a private associate physically walk a cloned boarding pass through the automated security scanners at the international airport terminal. When DeAndre inevitably checked his financial alerts and his location tracking software later this afternoon, he would see that a highly expensive plane ticket was purchased and successfully scanned at the airport gate. He would automatically assume that Chloe finally panicked, discovered the secret mistress, and fled out of the state with the baby. He would immediately send his expensive corporate lawyers and private investigators to frantically search the sunny beaches of southern Florida, looking for a terrified runaway wife. He would waste precious time and massive amounts of his stolen money chasing a complete digital ghost thousands of miles away from the real battlefield. But we were absolutely not going to the busy airport. I drove my heavy truck 30 miles completely outside the city limits into a dense, heavily wooded rural area. The tall pine trees blocked out the gray winter sky. We finally pulled up to a massive wrought iron security gate blocking a private paved driveway. I rolled down my truck window and punched a highly classified access code into the electronic keypad. The heavy metal gate swung open silently, revealing a sprawling, beautiful stone estate hidden completely out of sight from the main public road. I had quietly purchased this fortress property over 10 years ago through an anonymous corporate shell company just as a safe real estate investment. DeAndre had absolutely no idea this property even existed on the face of the earth. The entire estate was surrounded by high concrete walls topped with modern motion-sensing security cameras. More importantly, I had contracted a private team of highly trained armed security guards directly from an elite executive protection agency. Two men wearing dark suits and carrying visible weapons nodded to me respectfully as I drove past the main guardhouse. The estate was entirely impenetrable. No one could get in without my direct verbal authorization. I parked the truck inside the heated multi-car garage and carried little Leo inside the main house. The warm, comfortable house was already fully stocked with everything they could possibly need. My team had brought in fresh organic groceries, warm winter clothes in their exact sizes, and brand new educational toys for my grandson. Chloe walked slowly into the massive, elegant living room and immediately broke down crying again. But this time she was shedding tears of pure, overwhelming relief. The heavy, dark, crushing cloud of fear and anxiety had finally been permanently lifted from her tired shoulders. She was completely safe. Leo was completely safe. The two most precious angels of my entire life were fully secured behind an unbreakable wall of solid steel and heavy stone. I watched them sit together on the soft woven rug by the warm stone fireplace, playing happily with the new wooden train set. A profound sense of peace washed over my soul. The defensive portion of my plan was entirely complete. I knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow morning the corporate business world was going to erupt into absolute unimaginable chaos. DeAndre Washington was going to confidently walk into the annual shareholder meeting, believing he was an untouchable king. And I was going to be waiting there in the shadows, completely ready to destroy his entire existence. The morning of the annual shareholder meeting arrived with a bitter, freezing rain that washed the streets of downtown Chicago. But inside the grand ballroom of the luxurious hotel, everything was warm and brilliantly illuminated. DeAndre Washington had spared absolutely no expense for this event, because he was not paying for it. He had used the corporate accounts to rent out the largest, most expensive venue in the city. There were massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings and long tables covered in crisp white linen. Waiters in black tuxedos walked quietly around the room carrying silver trays of expensive pastries and freshly brewed imported coffee. It was a massive theatrical production designed entirely to make him look like a highly successful and powerful corporate king. I was standing quietly in the dark audio-visual control booth located at the very back of the massive ballroom. I was completely hidden behind a wall of tinted glass, watching the entire room through the digital camera monitors. I was still wearing the cheap, scratchy polyester security uniform. I had deliberately put it back on this morning because I wanted him to see exactly who he was dealing with when the time finally came. Evelyn Hayes was waiting silently in the private green room down the hallway, holding the heavy red leather briefcase filled with our financial ammunition. We were completely ready. I watched the monitors closely as DeAndre walked into the ballroom. He was wearing a brand new custom-tailored navy blue suit and a silk tie. He looked incredibly smug. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. I knew exactly why he was practically glowing with fake confidence. Earlier that morning, his private investigators had called him and confirmed that Chloe and little Leo had boarded a first-class flight to Miami. The digital decoy had worked perfectly. DeAndre truly believed that his terrified wife had completely broken down and run away. He thought she was hiding on a beach, thousands of miles away, completely abandoning her legal rights and leaving him free to execute the final stage of his massive financial crime. He thought the board was clear. He thought he had absolutely won. He walked confidently up to the front of the room, shaking hands with the wealthy board members and the senior investors. He smiled his perfect bright smile and patted men on the back, playing the role of the humble, hard-working leader. But my eyes were not just fixed on DeAndre. I directed one of the camera operators to zoom in on the front row of the audience. Sitting in the plush velvet chairs directly in front of the main presentation stage were the two biggest parasites of the entire Washington family. Jamal and Tasha were sitting there treating a highly secure corporate financial meeting like it was their own personal VIP lounge at a cheap nightclub. Jamal was wearing a loud burgundy velvet suit jacket and heavy dark sunglasses indoors. He had his legs crossed, ankle over knee, showing off a pair of designer leather loafers that cost more than my truck drivers made in an entire month. Tasha was sitting next to him wearing a highly inappropriate bright yellow cocktail dress and an enormous diamond necklace. They were not paying attention to the serious business conversations happening around them. They were too busy whispering to each other and laughing loudly at their own private jokes. A waiter walked by and Tasha actually snapped her fingers at him, demanding service. She took 2 crystal glasses filled with orange juice and expensive champagne from his silver tray. She handed one mimosa to her brother Jamal and kept the other for herself. They literally clinked their glasses together and took a long celebratory drink right there in the front row. They were toasting to their own massive greed. They were toasting to the fake bankruptcy that was supposed to completely destroy my sweet daughter, Chloe. Watching them sit there drinking champagne bought with the blood and sweat of my hardworking employees made a cold, dark rage flare up inside my chest. Sitting just a few feet away from the siblings at the main executive table was Victoria, the chief financial officer and DeAndre's secret mistress. She was wearing a sharp, expensive gray business suit, sitting perfectly straight, with a serious expression on her face. She had a thick binder of heavily manipulated financial reports resting on the table in front of her. Every few minutes, she would make brief, intense eye contact with DeAndre. It was a subtle secret language between two thieves. They were communicating silently, making sure they were both completely ready to pull off the greatest robbery in the history of this company. The sheer audacity of the three of them sitting in that room surrounded by the honest investors they were actively stealing from was absolutely staggering. The lights in the grand ballroom slowly began to dim. The low hum of conversations instantly faded away into total silence. A massive digital projector screen dropped down from the ceiling behind the main stage, displaying the bright blue and silver logo of Miller Global Freight. The time had finally come. DeAndre Washington stepped up to the wooden podium and adjusted the microphone. The bright stage spotlights hit his face, making him look like a massive corporate celebrity. He looked out over the crowded room of investors and smiled softly. "Good morning, everyone," DeAndre said, his deep voice echoing loudly through the high-end speakers. "Thank you all for being here today. We are standing at a very critical crossroad in the history of Miller Global Freight. As your chief executive officer, it is my absolute duty to navigate this massive ship through the unpredictable waters of the global economy. And as many of you know, the domestic logistics market has become incredibly challenging over the past 12 months. I stood in the dark booth, clenching my jaw. He was a spectacular liar. The domestic market was absolutely fine. The only reason the company accounts were struggling was because he and Victoria were draining millions of dollars into the Cayman Islands. But the wealthy investors sitting in the audience did not know that yet. They nodded their heads with serious expressions, completely buying into his fake corporate narrative. DeAndre pressed a button on his remote control, and the massive screen behind him changed to a highly complex financial graph. It showed a sharp downward red line representing the domestic operating revenue. It was a completely fabricated document. "We cannot rely on the old, outdated methods of the past," DeAndre continued, his voice rising with fake passion. "We cannot hold on to heavy domestic assets that are actively dragging down our profit margins. The world is changing rapidly, and we must change with it. That is why today I am officially announcing a massive strategic restructuring of our core business model. Jamal and Tasha smiled widely in the front row. They took another sip of their mimosas. They knew exactly what the word restructuring really meant. It meant liquidating the domestic truck fleets and selling off the local distribution centers. It meant deliberately crashing the American side of the company so DeAndre could wash the stolen money through the offshore shells and walk away a billionaire. Over the next 90 days, we will begin liquidating our redundant domestic freight divisions, DeAndre announced, spreading his hands out wide. We will be transferring our primary capital investments into specialized international holding groups. This restructuring will require us to take on some temporary high-interest debt to facilitate the massive transition, but I assure you this is the only way to secure the future of our empire. It is a bold move, but true leadership requires making the difficult choices that others are simply too afraid to make. The ballroom erupted into a round of polite professional applause. The board members were clapping for the man who was actively robbing them blind. DeAndre stood at the podium, soaking in the absolute admiration of the crowd. He looked down at Victoria, and she offered him a small, subtle nod of complete approval. He looked at Jamal and Tasha, who were raising their champagne glasses slightly in the air to salute him. He had done it. He had successfully pitched the destruction of my company, and the entire room had completely fallen for the lie. He thought he was the smartest man in the entire world. He thought the heavy crown of the logistics empire was resting firmly and permanently on his head. I reached out and placed my rough, calloused hand on the cold metal door handle of the audiovisual booth. The presentation was over. The trap was fully loaded, and the absolute perfect moment had arrived. I looked at the digital monitor one last time, watching him smile his arrogant, toxic smile. "Enjoy the applause, DeAndre," I whispered quietly to myself in the dark room. "Because it is the very last time anyone in this city will ever clap for you." I pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped out into the long carpeted hallway. It was time to show the entire world exactly what happens when you try to steal from a man who built his castle from the dirt up. The massive heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom were incredibly thick, but I pushed them open with the flat palms of my calloused hands. The heavy metal hinges groaned loudly, cutting entirely through the polite professional applause that had just filled the massive room. Every single head in the giant audience turned around at the exact same time. Hundreds of wealthy investors, senior board members, and elite corporate executives in their expensive tailored suits stared at the back entrance in complete silence. I stood in the doorway wearing the same scratchy polyester night shift security uniform I had worn for the past 2 long years. My heavy black work boots sank slightly into the thick, luxurious carpet. I did not rush my steps. I walked slowly and deliberately down the long center aisle of the ballroom. The bright crystal chandeliers above cast a harsh, blinding light on my faded blue uniform, but I held my head up high. The room smelled like expensive imported coffee and rich, expensive cologne. It was a room designed to intimidate ordinary working people. But I was not a tired old man sneaking into a place where he did not belong. I was the absolute king of this logistics empire, walking right back into his own castle. Up on the brightly lit main presentation stage, DeAndre Washington completely froze. The smug, victorious smile that had been plastered across his arrogant face just a few seconds ago suddenly vanished entirely. He gripped the edges of the thick wooden podium so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He looked at me with a mixture of absolute confusion and boiling, angry panic. He could not understand how the pathetic old man he had fired just yesterday morning had managed to bypass the tight security of this exclusive downtown hotel. He leaned aggressively into the microphone. His voice echoed loudly across the completely silent ballroom, entirely devoid of the smooth, professional tone he had been using just a moment earlier. "What is the meaning of this?" DeAndre demanded, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at me. "Security, get in here immediately. Grab this crazy old man and throw him out into the freezing street right now. He does not belong here. He is trespassing on highly restricted private corporate property." Down in the very front row of the audience, Jamal and Tasha Washington turned around in their plush velvet chairs. When they saw me walking down the center aisle in my cheap uniform, they both burst into loud, obnoxious, mocking laughter. Natasha actually covered her mouth with her manicured hand, trying to hide her cruel giggles as she leaned over to whisper something terrible to her older brother. Jamal shook his head and took another arrogant sip of his expensive champagne from his crystal glass. They thought this was a hilarious, desperate stunt. They genuinely believed I was just a broken, heartbroken father coming to beg for my minimum wage security job back in front of the entire wealthy company. 4 large private security guards wearing sharp black suits and communication earpieces immediately stepped out from the dark shadows near the emergency exits. They moved incredibly fast down the carpeted aisles to intercept me. DeAndre smiled a nasty, cruel smile from the brightly lit stage, fully expecting to watch me get physically tackled and dragged out of the room by my collar. But the heavy security guards did not grab my arms. They did not push me to the floor. As they closed in on me, the captain of the security team, a large, broad-shouldered man named Marcus, stepped directly into my path. Marcus and I had drank cheap, bitter coffee together out by the freezing loading docks at 3 in the morning for the past 2 years. He knew the heavy sacrifices I made for my family. He knew the honest calluses on my hands. I stopped walking and looked Marcus dead in his eyes. I did not say a single word out loud. I just gave him a slow, steady, respectful nod. Marcus stopped completely in his tracks. He raised his radio to his mouth and ordered his men to stand down immediately. The 4 large guards instantly stepped back and crossed their hands politely in front of them, forming a solid protective wall directly behind me instead of trying to stop me. The entire massive ballroom collectively gasped. The wealthy board members began murmuring to each other in absolute shock and total confusion. The dynamic power of the room shifted instantly. DeAndre stared at the security guards in complete disbelief. "I pay your salaries," he screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking with genuine terrified panic. "I order you to remove that piece of trash right now." But Marcus did not move a single muscle. Nobody in the room moved. The heavy silence in the massive ballroom became incredibly thick and suffocating. I reached the very front of the room, stopping just a few feet away from the main executive table. Victoria, the chief financial officer, and DeAndre's secret mistress, was sitting right there. Her sharp face had gone completely pale. She was staring at me like she was looking at a terrifying ghost. I reached up to my chest and wrapped my thick, rough fingers around the cheap plastic name tag pinned to my polyester shirt. It was the exact badge that labeled me as a minimum wage nobody. I pulled the sharp pin free and slowly tossed the plastic badge onto the polished mahogany table. It landed with a sharp, loud clatter right next to Victoria's heavily manipulated financial binders. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a heavy gunshot. "I am not here to secure the building today, DeAndre," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, but it carried a deep, heavy resonance that completely filled the massive room without needing an electronic microphone. "I am here to clean up a massive, disgusting spill." Right at that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open a second time. The crisp, sharp sound of high heels clicking violently against the marble entryway echoed down the center aisle. Evelyn Hayes, the most ruthless and terrifying corporate attorney in the entire Midwest, walked into the room. She was wearing a flawless black business suit and carrying a heavy red leather folio in her arms. She looked like a corporate grim reaper coming to collect a massive unpaid debt. She walked with absolute terrifying legal authority, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the wealthy investors. She marched straight down the aisle and took her place directly by my right side, standing perfectly tall. DeAndre looked at Evelyn and his face lost every single drop of its remaining color. He recognized her instantly. Every single powerful executive in the city of Chicago knew exactly who Evelyn Hayes was. She was the absolute master architect of the most impenetrable corporate trusts in the country. Seeing her standing next to a cheap security guard completely broke DeAndre's brain. He took a stumbling, terrified step back away from the wooden podium. I looked up at the stage, keeping my eyes locked entirely onto his terrified, sweating face. "You stood up here today and told these good people a magnificent lie, DeAndre." I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any human sympathy. "You told them the domestic market was failing. You told them we needed to liquidate our trucking fleets and take on toxic high-interest debt to save this entire empire. But you did not tell them the real truth. You did not tell them about the untraceable dummy corporations you and Victoria set up in the Cayman Islands. You did not tell them about the millions of dollars you have been secretly wiring offshore for the past 18 months while lying directly to their faces. The ballroom erupted into a massive frenzy of shocked, angry whispers. Board members shot straight out of their chairs. Victoria tried to stand up and grab her financial binders, but Evelyn Hayes slammed her hand down violently onto the mahogany table, pinning the fake documents completely in place. I turned slightly to look at the front row. Jamal and Tasha were no longer laughing. Their champagne glasses were frozen completely in their trembling hands. Their mouths were hanging wide open in pure, absolute shock. And you certainly did not tell the board that you have been using our corporate hospitality accounts to pay for a $50,000 a month penthouse for your sister. I continued, raising my voice just enough to cut entirely through the rising panic in the room. Or that you put your lazy, arrogant brother on the executive payroll for $300,000 a year to do absolutely nothing but drink on rented luxury yachts. Jamal dropped his crystal glass. It shattered violently on the hard floor, spilling expensive champagne and orange juice all over his designer leather loafers. He sank down incredibly low in his velvet chair, completely terrified and publicly humiliated. I turned my attention entirely back to the stage. DeAndre was shaking violently. Cold sweat was pouring down his forehead, completely ruining his perfect, expensive custom suit. You thought you were so incredibly smart, I said, taking one heavy step closer to the stage. You thought you could bankrupt this company, steal millions of dollars, and leave my sweet, innocent daughter holding all of the toxic debt. You thought you could use my 3-year-old grandson as a legal hostage to extort my entire life savings. You looked at me and you only saw a tired old truck driver in a cheap uniform. You thought you could just snap your expensive fingers and throw me out into the street. You called me into your lavish corner office yesterday morning and you fired me without a second thought. I paused, letting the heavy silence return to the room for just a brief, terrible second. I wanted him to feel the absolute crushing weight of the words I was about to say. I wanted it burned entirely into his memory for the rest of his miserable, ruined life. You fired the guard, DeAndre? I said, my voice dropping to a low, incredibly dangerous growl. But today the chairman of the board is firing you. DeAndre shook his head frantically. No, he stammered, his voice incredibly weak and pathetic. No, that is completely impossible. You do not own anything. You are just a broke old man. I am the chief executive officer. I hold all the power here. I did not answer him. I simply gave a small nod to Evelyn. She stepped forward and smoothly unzipped the heavy red leather folio. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy official watermarked paper. She turned to face the entire audience of panicked board members and wealthy, angry investors. My name is Evelyn Hayes, she announced, her voice ringing out with absolute, sharp, undeniable authority. I am the senior managing partner of Hayes & Sterling Legal Associates. I stand here today acting as the primary legal counsel and sole executor of the Miller Global Freight Blind Trust. She held up the thick legal document for the entire massive room to see clearly. For the past 10 years, the true identity of the majority shareholder of this corporation has been strictly protected under a highly classified legal structure, she explained, reading directly from the notarized pages. Today, that trust is officially dissolved by the direct, absolute order of the primary beneficiary. Let the official corporate record show that Mr. Harrison Miller, the man standing before you right now, is the sole legal owner of 85% of all voting shares in this multinational corporation. He is the founder, the primary original financier, and the absolute supreme authority of this entire board. The reaction in the grand ballroom was completely explosive. It was exactly like a massive bomb had gone off directly inside the room. Several wealthy older investors actually shouted out loud in absolute profound shock. The senior board members, who had just politely applauded DeAndre's fake restructuring plan, began scrambling backwards away from the executive table like the floor was suddenly covered in fire. They realized instantly that they had just witnessed a massive historic corporate execution, and they wanted to be as far away from the blast zone as possible. Up on the brightly lit stage, DeAndre Washington physically collapsed. His weak knees buckled completely underneath him, and he fell heavily against the thick wooden podium, knocking the microphone directly to the floor with a loud piercing screech of electronic feedback. The color violently drained from his entire face, leaving him looking exactly like a terrified, sick ghost. His perfectly manicured hands gripped the rough edge of the stage as he gasped desperately for air. He stared at me with wide, unblinking, horrified eyes, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of his catastrophic mistake. He had not just stolen from a wealthy, anonymous, faceless corporation. He had been actively robbing the exact man who built the entire empire with his own bare hands. He had emotionally abused and threatened the daughter of the only man who held the absolute power to crush his entire existence into dust. Every single arrogant insult he had ever thrown at my face, every single time he had openly mocked my dirty work boots and my calloused working hands, came rushing back to him in a blinding, devastating flash of terrifying realization. Down at the main executive table, Victoria pushed her heavy chair back violently and tried to run toward the side emergency exit doors. She did not even make it 5 steps before Marcus and his large security guards stepped directly into her path, physically blocking her escape with their massive shoulders. She screamed in panic and dropped her expensive designer purse, spilling her keys and expensive makeup all across the luxurious carpet. She was trapped just like the rest of them. I did not look at her crying on the floor. I did not look at Jamal or Tasha, who were now sobbing hysterically in the front row, fully realizing their fake billionaire lifestyles were completely and permanently over. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the broken, pathetic man sobbing on the main stage. The massive, righteous indignation that had been burning hot inside my chest for 2 long, terrible years finally erupted into a profound, incredible sense of deep emotional satisfaction. The cheap polyester uniform no longer felt scratchy or heavy on my shoulders. It felt exactly like the greatest suit of heavy armor a protective father could ever possibly wear. I had walked into the room looking like a forgotten ghost, but I was walking out as a victorious king who had just slaughtered the toxic dragons threatening his family. The massive, heavy wheel of universal karma had finally finished turning, and it had crushed DeAndre Washington directly into the cold, hard dirt. I stepped completely around the broken man sobbing on the floor of the stage. DeAndre was gasping for air and clutching his chest, but I felt absolutely no pity for him. I reached down and took the small plastic remote control for the massive projector screen right out of his sweaty, trembling hand. He did not even try to fight me for it. All of the fake corporate strength had completely drained out of his body. Evelyn Hayes walked over to the main computer terminal, sitting on the edge of the stage. She plugged our encrypted flash drive directly into the system. I pressed the input button on the remote control. The giant digital screen behind me flickered for a second. The completely fabricated red line graph showing the failing domestic market vanished into the dark. It was instantly replaced by a massive high-resolution scan of an offshore banking statement. "Look at the screen," I told the silent audience of wealthy investors. My voice carried a heavy, freezing weight that demanded absolute attention. "This is the real restructuring plan your former chief executive officer was trying to sell you today. These are the corporate bank accounts for 3 highly secretive shell companies located deep in the Cayman Islands. If you look closely at the primary beneficiary listed at the bottom of the documents, you will not see the name of this company. You will see the name DeAndre Washington. Over the past 18 months, he and our chief financial officer, Victoria, have systematically siphoned over $12 million from our domestic operating budget directly into these untraceable offshore accounts. They manufactured a fake financial crisis so they could wash the stolen money and walk away as billionaires while leaving my company and my family completely bankrupt." The entire ballroom erupted into a chorus of angry, disgusted whispers. Wealthy board members were adjusting their reading glasses and staring up at the massive 100-inch screen in pure disbelief. I pressed the button on the remote again. The screen shifted to display a series of highly confidential emails between DeAndre and Victoria. I did not need to read the graphic details out loud because the text was massive and completely legible for everyone in the room to see. The emails detailed their secret weekend hotel trips and their expensive dinners. But more importantly, the emails contained their exact written plans to forge corporate signatures and bypass the internal financial security audits. Victoria was still sitting down at the main executive table surrounded by the large security guards. She buried her face completely in her shaking hands, trying desperately to hide from the burning judgmental stares of the investors she had betrayed. The board members who had trusted her with their money were now looking at her like she was a venomous snake. But the absolute theft of $12 million was only half of the massive execution I had planned for today. I clicked the remote control again. The screen changed from the offshore bank accounts to a bright, colorful social media photograph. It was the exact picture of DeAndre's older brother Jamal standing on the rented luxury yacht in Miami, holding his expensive champagne and his imported cigar. Let us talk about the massive corporate bloat that was supposedly dragging down our profit margins, I said, pointing a calloused finger directly at the giant screen. This man is Jamal Washington. According to the highly manipulated payroll documents signed by Victoria, this man is currently employed as a senior logistics strategist. He is paid an annual salary of $300,000 from our corporate accounts. But Jamal has never managed a single freight load in his entire life. He is a phantom employee, a complete ghost. His consulting firm is nothing but a fake paper corporation designed to steal the honest wages of the men and women who actually drive our heavy trucks through the freezing rain. I looked down at the front row. Jamal was completely paralyzed in his velvet chair. The arrogant velvet suit and the heavy dark sunglasses could not hide the absolute sheer terror radiating from his body. Everyone in the ballroom was staring directly at him. The wealthy investors who actually worked for their fortunes looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. I pressed the button one more time. The screen flashed to a new image. It was a picture of DeAndre's younger sister Tasha standing inside her massive walk-in closet, showing off hundreds of pairs of designer shoes. Next to the picture was a scanned copy of a corporate lease agreement. "And this is Tasha Washington," I announced to the room. Our former chief executive officer decided to use our corporate client hospitality budget to lease a $50,000 a month luxury penthouse in Manhattan for his younger sister. He also issued her a platinum corporate credit card, which she has personally used to purchase over $400,000 worth of designer clothing, expensive spa treatments, and diamond jewelry. They were living the lives of fake royalty while telling my own daughter that she needed to clip grocery coupons just to buy baby formula for my grandson. Tasha looked like she was going to be physically sick. She slouched down so low in her chair, trying to make herself completely invisible, but there was absolutely nowhere for her to hide in the brightly lit ballroom. The investors were furious. They were yelling at the stage, demanding immediate legal action and total financial restitution. Evelyn Hayes stepped up to the wooden podium and adjusted her crisp black suit jacket. She looked out over the angry crowd and raised her hand to call for silence. The room quieted down almost instantly out of pure respect for her terrifying legal reputation. "You do not need to worry about filing lawsuits today, gentlemen," Evelyn said, her voice sharp and perfectly clear. "Mr. Miller and I have been working quietly for the past 5 days. Early this morning, we stood before a federal judge and presented all of the financial evidence you are seeing on this screen right now. We have already secured emergency ex parte court injunctions. We have completely frozen every single domestic bank account tied to DeAndre Jamal and Tasha Washington. We have also worked with international authorities to lock down the Cayman Island shell companies pending a massive federal criminal investigation." Just as Evelyn finished her sentence, a sharp, buzzing sound echoed from the front row. Tasha Washington jumped in her seat. Her expensive gold-plated cellular phone was vibrating loudly against the wooden armrest of her chair. She reached out with a violently trembling hand and picked up the phone. She stared at the bright screen and let out a sudden sharp gasp of pure horror. Her bank was sending her automated text messages. The platinum corporate credit card she had used to live her fake high society life had just been officially declined and completely canceled. A second message followed immediately stating that her personal checking and savings accounts had been placed under an emergency federal freeze. She had absolutely zero access to any money. The $50,000 a month penthouse lease was already being legally terminated, and she was going to be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing but the clothes she was wearing. Jamal frantically pulled his own cellular phone out of his velvet jacket pocket. He typed in his password with shaking fingers and opened his banking application. The screen loaded and his face went completely gray. The massive numbers he was used to seeing had been replaced by a bright red warning banner stating that his accounts were seized by court order. The fake consulting firm he used to launder the stolen money was completely dismantled. He could not even afford to buy a cup of cheap coffee, let alone rent another luxury yacht. "No," Jamal whispered, staring at his phone. "This cannot be happening. This is my money. You cannot just take all of my money." I looked down at him from the stage, feeling a deep, profound satisfaction settling into my bones. "It was never your money, Jamal," I told him, my voice echoing heavily in the silent room. "You were just holding on to it for me, and now I am taking every single penny of it back." The total financial dismantling was an absolute masterpiece of legal destruction. We had not just fired them from their fake corporate jobs. We had systematically stripped them of every single stolen asset they possessed. We had ripped the expensive clothes off their backs and exposed them to the entire world as the greedy, pathetic parasites they truly were. They had built an entire world out of lies and stolen money, and I had just crushed that entire world into fine dust in less than 15 minutes. DeAndre was still curled up on the floor of the stage, completely unable to stand on his own 2 feet. He had lost his massive salary. He had lost his fake offshore millions. He had lost his power and his prestigious reputation. The investors he had tried to manipulate were now actively discussing how many years he was going to spend in a federal prison. His master plan to destroy my daughter and steal my grandson was completely dead. The financial execution was absolute and entirely flawless. I stood tall on the stage, watching the beautiful, devastating chaos unfold around me, knowing that I had finally secured the permanent safety of my family. The massive ballroom was completely engulfed in a storm of angry voices and panicked shouts. The wealthy investors were demanding answers from the terrified board members. Down in the front row, Jamal and Tasha were arguing with each other, pointing fingers, and desperately trying to shift the blame for their ruined lives. Victoria was still trapped at the executive table, silently crying into her hands. But my eyes never left DeAndre Washington. He was slowly trying to pull himself up from the floor of the stage, using the wooden podium for support. His expensive custom suit was wrinkled and stained with his own cold sweat. He looked out at the angry crowd of investors, and I could see the gears turning in his desperate mind. He was trying to figure out a way to lie his way out of this. He was trying to calculate who he could bribe or what fake story he could spin to save his own skin. He still did not fully understand that the game was completely over and there was absolutely no escape. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open for the absolute final time. The loud arguments and the frantic shouting in the room instantly died down into a thick, terrifying silence. A large group of men and women walked through the doors, moving with a cold, calculated military precision. They were not wearing expensive tailored suits like the wealthy investors. They were wearing dark windbreakers with large yellow letters printed boldly across their backs. Half of them were federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The other half were senior forensic investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Evelyn Hayes had not just frozen his bank accounts. She had handed over our massive mountain of digital evidence directly to the federal authorities hours before this meeting even began. The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes and a completely expressionless face, walked straight down the center aisle. He did not look at the angry investors. He did not look at the crying siblings in the front row. He walked with absolute, undeniable authority directly toward the brightly lit stage. 2 heavily armed agents flanked him on either side. The wealthy corporate executives quickly stepped out of their way, practically climbing over the expensive chairs just to avoid standing in the path of a federal raid. DeAndre watched the federal agents approach the stage, and the very last tiny spark of hope completely died in his eyes. He let go of the wooden podium and took a clumsy, terrified step backward. He looked wildly toward the side emergency exits, but my security team was already blocking every single door in the massive room. There was absolutely nowhere for him to run. There was no secret offshore account that could buy his way out of this exact moment. The lead agent stepped up onto the stage. He did not yell. He did not need to. His voice was calm and heavy with the absolute power of the federal government. DeAndre Washington, the agent said, looking at my son-in-law with pure professional disgust. You are under arrest for massive corporate fraud, international money laundering, and severe felony embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Two agents stepped forward and grabbed DeAndre's arms. He flinched violently, trying to pull away from their tight grip, but they were incredibly strong. They yanked him violently away from the chief executive chair he loved so much. They spun him around and forced his hands firmly behind his back. The sharp, heavy, metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing across the silent ballroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It sounded exactly like pure, flawless justice. Down on the floor, other federal agents were already moving in on Victoria. They pulled her out of her chair and placed her in handcuffs, reading her the exact same rights. They were going to dismantle the entire criminal operation right here in front of the entire corporate world. But DeAndre was entirely broken. As the federal agents began to pull him toward the edge of the stage, he dug his expensive Italian shoes into the thick carpet, trying desperately to stop them. He turned his head and looked directly at me. The arrogant, smug monster who had mocked my calloused hands and threatened to steal my 3-year-old grandson was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, pathetic little boy, crying uncontrollably. "Harry, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, miserable whine. "Harry, you have to stop them. You can tell them it was just a massive misunderstanding. We can fix the financial accounts together. I can give all the money back to you, please. Harry, do not let them put me in a federal prison. I will not survive in there. We are family, Harry. Please remember that we are family." I stood perfectly still in my cheap, scratchy polyester security uniform. I looked down at the pathetic man wearing the steel handcuffs. The massive room was completely silent, waiting to hear what the true king of the empire would say. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I did not feel a single ounce of mercy. I thought about my beautiful daughter Chloe crying in the parking lot of the discount grocery store because she could not afford to buy winter clothes for her baby. I thought about the sheer terror in her eyes when she told me how he had threatened to take little Leo away from her forever to extort my life savings. I took one slow, deliberate step toward him. I looked directly into his terrified, crying eyes, and I delivered the absolute final blow. "You forgot one extremely important thing, DeAndre," I said, my voice low, cold, and completely devoid of any human sympathy. "I am a father, and my daughter is my only family." DeAndre let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair. He finally realized that his massive ego and his endless greed had destroyed his entire life. He had completely underestimated the quiet, protective love of a working-class father, and it had cost him absolutely everything. I stood tall and watched with deep, profound satisfaction as the federal agents physically dragged the crying, broken man out of the grand ballroom and into the freezing rain outside. It has been exactly 3 months since the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom slammed shut on the darkest and most terrifying chapter of my family history. I am no longer wearing a scratchy, cheap polyester security uniform. I am sitting in the massive leather chair behind the custom mahogany desk on the 50th floor of the Miller Global Freight headquarters. But this time, the room feels completely different. The toxic, suffocating arrogance that used to fill this corner office is entirely gone forever. The air in the room is clean, and the bright morning sunlight streams beautifully through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I am looking down at the massive loading docks below, watching the heavy diesel trucks roll out of the yard. The deep, familiar rumble of those massive engines brings a profound sense of absolute peace to my weary soul. I am not alone in the massive executive office today. Sitting right on my lap, holding a bright yellow plastic toy truck, is my 3-year-old grandson, Leo. He is laughing out loud and pointing his tiny finger at the massive vehicles down below. His bright, innocent eyes are full of absolute wonder and complete joy. I wrap my thick, calloused arms securely around his small, warm body and rest my chin gently on top of his soft head. We are completely safe. The heavy stone walls of our family fortress are secure, and the monsters have been permanently banished into the cold, dark wilderness. The massive legal machinery of the federal government moves with a slow, terrifying, and absolute certainty. DeAndre Washington is no longer wearing custom-tailored Italian suits or drinking expensive imported champagne on rented yachts. He is currently wearing a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit, sitting inside a tiny concrete cell at a maximum security federal penitentiary. His massive criminal trial did not take very long at all because the absolute mountain of digital evidence Evelyn Hayes handed over to the authorities was completely undeniable in every possible way. His secret mistress, Victoria, took a sweeping federal plea deal the very second she was placed in handcuffs. She turned over every single hidden computer password and testified aggressively against him in open court just to save herself from a maximum prison sentence. When the federal judge banged his heavy wooden gavel, he looked DeAndre dead in the eyes and sentenced him to 15 hard years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. DeAndre lost absolutely everything he had ever valued in his pathetic, superficial life. The massive offshore bank accounts hidden deep in the Cayman Islands were completely seized and fully repatriated to my company. His fancy imported sports cars were auctioned off by the federal government to pay for his massive legal fines and restitution penalties. He went from being a completely untouchable corporate king to a forgotten federal inmate number in the blink of an eye. He will spend the next 15 years of his miserable life sleeping on a thin, painful mattress, staring at a blank, gray concrete wall, realizing that his endless greed and sheer arrogance cost him the only real family he ever truly had. The crushing, heavy weight of universal karma did not stop with DeAndre alone. It crashed down incredibly hard upon his greedy, parasitic siblings as well. Jamal and Tasha Washington had built their entire identities around fake luxury and stolen corporate wealth. When the emergency federal freeze hit their personal bank accounts, their glamorous fake lives evaporated completely into thin air overnight. Tasha was physically evicted from the massive $50,000 a month Manhattan penthouse by armed federal marshals. The luxury real estate brokers tossed her expensive designer bags and custom shoes directly onto the dirty, wet city sidewalk for everyone to see. Her platinum corporate credit cards were legally shredded into tiny, useless pieces. All of those wealthy internet friends and high society socialites she used to party with completely abandoned her the exact second they realized she was totally broke and under a massive federal criminal investigation. Today, Tasha is drowning entirely in a massive, deep ocean of personal financial debt. She was forced to take a minimum wage job working the miserable night shift at a cheap retail clothing store just to pay the rent on a tiny roach-infested studio apartment, located deep in the dangerous outskirts of the city. She spends her long days hiding her face in deep absolute shame, entirely ostracized by the very people she used to desperately try to impress. Her older brother Jamal suffered an equally devastating and highly public fate. The federal authorities officially seized his fake corporate consulting firm and completely liquidated every single physical asset he had ever purchased with my stolen money. His rented luxury yachts are entirely gone. His expensive velvet suits and heavy solid gold chains were legally pawned by the government to pay off his massive outstanding tax liabilities. Jamal currently lives on a worn-out, dirty couch in the damp, unfinished basement of a distant cousin who barely tolerates his presence. He has no money, no high society status, and absolutely zero respect from anyone in his community. They both learned the hardest and most painful lesson a person can ever possibly learn in this life. When you build your massive, beautiful castle entirely out of stolen sand, the universe will always send a massive, violent wave to wash it all away into the dark ocean. They treated my sweet, innocent daughter like she was absolute worthless trash, and now they are the ones forced to dig through the garbage every single day just to physically survive. But out of all the incredible destruction and massive legal chaos, the most beautiful and inspiring transformation belonged entirely to my daughter, Chloe. The heavy, dark, crushing shadow of fear and severe emotional anxiety that used to control her every single movement is completely gone from her life. Her divorce was officially finalized last week with absolute brutal legal efficiency. Evelyn Hayes completely eviscerated DeAndre's expensive defense lawyers in the downtown family court. Chloe retained full permanent and absolute sole physical custody of little Leo. DeAndre was legally stripped of all parental rights entirely, meaning he can never again use the boy as a terrifying weapon against us. Chloe never has to look over her shoulder ever again in fear. She never has to check a tracking application on her cellular phone or beg for permission to buy warm winter clothes for her own child. She has her entire life back. She has the bright, beautiful spark back in her warm brown eyes, and her gentle, sincere laugh fills our home with absolute pure joy. I did not want her to just simply survive the terrible trauma inflicted upon her. I wanted her to thrive completely and absolutely as an independent, strong woman. So I used the massive recovered assets of Miller Global Freight to establish a brand new permanent charitable foundation. It is a massive pediatric medical charity dedicated entirely to providing free healthcare and advanced medical equipment to sick children living in underprivileged neighborhoods across the entire country. And I proudly appointed Chloe as the primary executive director and chief operating officer of the entire charitable foundation. She is officially back to doing exactly what she loves most in this beautiful world. She is helping sick children heal. She has her own beautiful, massive corner office, her own massive operational budget, and absolute total financial independence. She is actively transforming her own terrible emotional pain into massive, beautiful healing for hundreds of innocent, struggling families. I have never been more incredibly proud of her in my entire long life. I sit peacefully in my large, comfortable leather chair, holding little Leo incredibly close to my chest. He rests his warm, sleepy head against my shoulder and lets out a soft, happy sigh. I look down at my hands resting gently on his small back. The heavy, thick calluses and the deep, rough lines are still there. They are permanent physical reminders of the freezing cold nights I spent sleeping in the cramped cab of my rusted old Peterbilt truck. They are stark reminders of the brutal 20 years I spent hauling heavy commercial freight across the dangerous icy mountain highways just to build a safe, impenetrable fortress for my family. For a brief, terrifying moment last year, I truly thought I had accidentally handed the precious keys to that fortress directly to a vicious monster. I thought all of my silent, grueling sacrifices had been completely in vain. But the universe has a highly specific and beautiful way of balancing the grand scales of justice. The weak and the innocent are lifted high up into the light, and the wicked are violently thrown down into the cold, dark dirt where they belong. I gently kiss the top of my grandson's head and look out the massive glass window at the bright, clear blue sky stretching out over the city. The massive, powerful diesel engines roar loudly to life down in the busy yard, and another heavy transport truck pulls out onto the open highway carrying the Miller Global Freight name proudly across the entire country. The dark, terrifying storm has officially passed us by. A brand new, beautiful golden dawn has finally broken over our entire lives. We are completely healed from the terrible wounds of the past. We are entirely whole once again as a loving family. And most importantly, we are absolutely forever safe. You see, my friends, money does not make a man. Integrity does. Hard work and a clean conscience are the only true things you can ever take to your grave. When I put on that cheap polyester security uniform every single night, I did not feel small or humiliated. I felt the quiet, absolute pride of a father who was willing to do absolutely anything to protect his family. DeAndre and his siblings thought that wearing expensive custom suits and driving imported luxury cars made them completely untouchable. They looked down on my calloused hands and my old pickup truck because they fundamentally misunderstood what true power actually looks like. True power is not about how much money you can steal or how many people you can intimidate. True power is the absolute unwavering dedication to the people you love. Never mistake a father's quiet patience for weakness. We might step back into the dark shadows to let the next generation shine. We might bite our tongues and swallow our hard pride to keep the peace in the family. We might let you believe that you are the smartest person in the entire room. But the very second you threaten our children or try to harm the innocent grandchildren we cherish, all of that quiet patience instantly vanishes. We will move heaven and earth to protect our own. We will tear down the massive steel empires we spent our entire lives building just to make sure our daughters never have to shed another tear of terrifying fear. We will walk through absolute fire to keep them completely safe from the monsters of this world. This long, painful journey has taught me that the universe always keeps a perfect ledger. You cannot build a beautiful life on a rotten foundation of lies and deep cruelty. The truth will always eventually find its way out into the bright light. If you treat good people like they are completely disposable, the universe will eventually dispose of you. But if you fight with honor and fiercely protect the innocent, you will always find a way to stand back up on your own 2 feet. If my journey resonated with your heart today, and if you truly believe that karma always comes to collect its heavy debts, I am asking you to hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue to share these powerful life lessons together. Please leave a comment down below telling me exactly what city you are watching from and what time it is right now. I read every single comment because I want to know exactly where my true supporters are located across the world. Your kind words give me the strength to keep sharing my absolute truth. Thank you for walking this incredible path of justice with me today. Stay strong, keep your head held high, and I will see you in the next story.